Crome Yellow by Aldous Huxley. Chapter 1. Along this particular stretch of line no express had ever passed. All the trains, the few that there were, stopped at all the stations. Denis knew the names of those stations by heart: Bowl, Tritton, Spavin Delaware, Knipswich for Timpany, West Bolby, and, finally, Camlet on the Water. Camlet was where he always got out, leaving the train to creep indolently onward, goodness only knew whither, into the green heart of England. They were snorting out of West Bolby now. It was the next station, thank heaven. Denis took his chattels off the rack and piled them neatly in the corner opposite his own. A futile proceeding, but one must have something to do. When he had finished, he sank back into his seat and closed his eyes. It was extremely hot. Oh, this journey! It was 2 hours cut clean out of his life. 2 hours in which he might have done so much, so much. Written the perfect poem, for example, or read the one illuminating book. Instead of which, his gorge rose at the smell of the dusty cushions against which he was leaning. 2 hours, 120 minutes. Anything might be done in that time. Anything, nothing. Oh, he had had hundreds of hours. And what had he done with them? Wasted them. Spilt the precious minutes as though his reservoir were inexhaustible. Denis groaned in the spirit, condemned himself utterly with all his works. What right had he to sit in the sunshine, to occupy corner seats in third-class carriages, to be alive? None, none, none. Misery and a nameless nostalgic distress possessed him. He was 23, and oh, so agonisingly conscious of the fact. The train came bumpingly to a halt. Here was Camlet at last. Denis jumped up, crammed his hat over his eyes, deranged his pile of baggage, leaned out of the window and shouted for a porter, seized a bag in either hand, and had to put them down again in order to open the door. When at last he had safely bundled himself and his baggage onto the platform, he ran up the train toward the van. A bicycle, he said breathlessly to the guard. He felt himself a man of action. The guard paid no attention, but continued methodically to hand out, one by one, the packages labelled to Camlet. A bicycle, Denis repeated. A green machine, cross-framed, name of Stone, Stone. "All in good time, sir," said the guard soothingly. He was a large, stately man with a naval beard. One pictured him at home, drinking tea, surrounded by a numerous family. It was in that tone that he must have spoken to his children when they were tiresome. "All in good time, sir." Denis's man of action collapsed, punctured. He left his luggage to be called for later and pushed off on his bicycle. He always took his bicycle when he went into the country. It was part of the theory of exercise. One day one would get up at 6 o'clock and pedal away to Kenilworth or Stratford-on-Avon, anywhere, and within a radius of 20 miles there were always Norman churches and Tudor mansions to be seen in the course of an afternoon's excursion. Somehow they never did get seen, but all the same it was nice to feel that the bicycle was there and that one fine morning one really might get up at 6. Once at the top of the long hill which led up from Camlet Station, he felt his spirits mounting. The world, he found, was good. The faraway blue hills, the harvests whitening on the slopes of the ridge along which his road led him, the treeless skylines that changed as he moved, yes, they were all good. He was overcome by the beauty of those deeply embayed combes scooped in the flanks of the ridge beneath him. Curves, curves. He repeated the word slowly, trying as he did to find some term in which to give expression to his appreciation. Curves. No, that was inadequate. He made a gesture with his hand as though to scoop the achieved expression out of the air, and almost fell off his bicycle. What was the word to describe the curves of those little valleys? They were as fine as the lines of a human body. They were informed with the subtlety of art. Galbe. That was a good word, but it was French. Le galbe est vase de ses anges. Had one ever read a French novel in which that phrase didn't occur? Some day he would compile a dictionary for the use of novelists. Galbe, gonfle, goulu. Parfum, pau, pervers, potel, pudeur, vertu, volupte. But he really must find that word. Curves, curves. Those little valleys had the lines of a cup moulded round a woman's breast. They seemed the dinted imprints of some huge divine body that had rested on these hills. Cumbrous locutions these, but through them he seemed to be getting nearer to what he wanted. Dinted, dimpled, wimpled, his mind wandered down echoing corridors of assonance and alliteration, ever further and further from the point. He was enamoured with the beauty of words. Becoming once more aware of the outer world, he found himself on the crest of a descent. The road plunged down, steep and straight, into a considerable valley. There, on the opposite slope, a little higher up the valley, stood Crome, his destination. He put on his brakes. This view of Crome was pleasant to linger over. The façade, with its 3 projecting towers, rose precipitously from among the dark trees of the garden. The house basked in full sunlight. The old brick rosily glowed. How ripe and rich it was! How superbly mellow, and at the same time, how austere! The hill was becoming steeper and steeper. He was gaining speed in spite of his brakes. He loosed his grip of the levers and, in a moment, was rushing headlong down. 5 minutes later, he was passing through the gate of the great courtyard. The front door stood hospitably open. He left his bicycle leaning against the wall and walked in. He would take them by surprise. End of chapter. Chapter 2. He took nobody by surprise. There was nobody to take. All was quiet. Denis wandered from room to empty room, looking with pleasure at the familiar pictures and furniture, at all the little untidy signs of life that lay scattered here and there. He was rather glad that they were all out. It was amusing to wander through the house as though one were exploring a dead, deserted Pompeii. What sort of life would the excavator reconstruct from these remains? How would he people these empty chambers? There was the long gallery with its rows of respectable and, though of course one couldn't publicly admit it, rather boring Italian primitives, its Chinese sculptures, its unobtrusive, dateless furniture. There was the panelled drawing-room, where the huge chintz-covered armchairs stood, oases of comfort among the austere, flesh-mortifying antiques. There was the morning-room with its pale lemon walls, its painted Venetian chairs and rococo tables, its mirrors, its modern pictures. There was the library, cool, spacious and dark, book-lined from floor to ceiling, rich in portentous folios. There was the dining-room, solidly, port-winily English, with its great mahogany table, its 18th-century chairs and sideboard, its 18th-century pictures, family portraits, meticulous animal paintings. What could one reconstruct from such data? There was much of Henry Wimbush in the long gallery and the library, something of Anne, perhaps, in the morning-room. That was all. Among the accumulations of 10 generations, the living had left but few traces. Lying on the table in the morning-room, he saw his own book of poems. What tact! He picked it up and opened it. It was what the reviewers call a slim volume. He read at hazard. But silence and the topless dark vault in the lights of Luna Park, and Blackpool from the nightly gloom hollows a bright tumultuous tomb. He put it down again, shook his head and sighed. What genius I had then, he reflected, echoing the aged Swift. It was nearly 6 months since the book had been published. He was glad to think he would never write anything of the same sort again. Who could have been reading it, he wondered. Anne, perhaps. He liked to think so. Perhaps, too, she had at last recognised herself in the hamadryad of the poplar sapling, the slim hamadryad whose movements were like the swaying of a young tree in the wind. The woman who was a tree was what he had called the poem. He had given her the book when it came out, hoping that the poem would tell her what he hadn't dared to say. She had never referred to it. He shut his eyes and saw a vision of her in a red velvet cloak, swaying into the little restaurant where they sometimes dined together in London. 3/4 of an hour late, and he was at his table, haggard with anxiety, irritation, hunger. Oh, she was damnable. It occurred to him that perhaps his hostess might be in her boudoir. It was a possibility. He would go and see. Mrs. Wimbush's boudoir was in the central tower on the garden front, a little staircase corkscrewed up to it from the hall. Denis mounted, tapped at the door. "Come in." Ah, she was there. He had rather hoped she wouldn't be. He opened the door. Priscilla Wimbush was lying on the sofa. A blotting pad rested on her knees, and she was thoughtfully sucking the end of a silver pencil. "Hullo," she said, looking up. "I'd forgotten you were coming." "Well, here I am, I'm afraid," said Denis deprecatingly. "I'm awfully sorry." Mrs. Wimbush laughed. Her voice, her laughter were deep and masculine. Everything about her was manly. She had a large, square, middle-aged face with a massive, projecting nose and little greenish eyes, the whole surmounted by a lofty and elaborate coiffure of a curiously improbable shade of orange. Looking at her, Denis always thought of Wilkie Bard as the cantatrice. "That's why I'm going to sing in opera, sing in opera, sing in opera." Today she was wearing a purple silk dress with a high collar and a row of pearls. The costume, so richly dowagerous, so suggestive of the royal family, made her look more than ever like something on the halls. "What have you been doing all this time?" she asked. "Well," said Denis, and he hesitated almost voluptuously. He had a tremendously amusing account of London and its doings all ripe and ready in his mind. It would be a pleasure to give it utterance. "To begin with," he said. But he was too late. Mrs. Wimbush's question had been what the grammarians call rhetorical. It asked for no answer. It was a little conversational flourish, a gambit in the polite game. "You find me busy at my horoscopes," she said, without even being aware that she had interrupted him. A little pained, Denis decided to reserve his story for more receptive ears. He contented himself, by way of revenge, with saying, "Oh," rather icily. "Did I tell you how I won 400 on the Grand National this year?" "Yes," he replied, still frigid and monosyllabic. She must have told him at least 6 times. "Wonderful, isn't it? Everything is in the stars. In the old days, before I had the stars to help me, I used to lose thousands. Now," she paused an instant, "well, look at that 400 on the Grand National. That's the stars." Denis would have liked to hear more about the old days, but he was too discreet and, still more, too shy to ask. There had been something of a bust-up, that was all he knew. Old Priscilla, not so old then, of course, and sprightlier, had lost a great deal of money, dropped it in handfuls and hatfuls on every racecourse in the country. She had gambled, too. The number of thousands varied in the different legends, but all put it high. Henry Wimbush was forced to sell some of his primitives, a Taddeo da Poggibonsi, an Amico de Taddeo and 4 or 5 nameless Sienese, to the Americans. There was a crisis. For the first time in his life, Henry asserted himself. And with good effect, it seemed. Priscilla's gay and gadding existence had come to an abrupt end. Nowadays she spent almost all her time at Crome, cultivating a rather ill-defined malady. For consolation, she dallied with New Thought and the occult. Her passion for racing still possessed her, and Henry, who was a kind-hearted fellow at bottom, allowed her £40 a month betting money. Most of Priscilla's days were spent in casting the horoscopes of horses, and she invested her money scientifically as the stars dictated. She betted on football too, and had a large notebook in which she registered the horoscopes of all the players in all the teams of the league. The process of balancing the horoscopes of 2 11s, one against the other, was a very delicate and difficult one. A match between the Spurs and the Villa entailed a conflict in the heavens so vast and so complicated that it was not to be wondered at if she sometimes made a mistake about the outcome. "Such a pity you don't believe in these things, Denis. Such a pity," said Mrs. Wimbush in her deep, distinct voice. "I can't say I feel it so." "Ah, that's because you don't know what it's like to have faith. You've no idea how amusing and exciting life becomes when you do believe. All that happens means something. Nothing you do is ever insignificant. It makes life so jolly, you know. Here am I at Crome, dull as ditch-water, you'd think. No, I don't find it so. I don't regret the old days a bit. I have the stars." She picked up the sheet of paper that was lying on the blotting-pad. "Inman's horoscope," she explained. "I thought I'd like to have a little fling on the billiards championships this autumn. I have the infinite to keep in tune with." She waved her hand. "And then there's the next world and all the spirits and one's aura and Mrs. Eddy saying you're not ill and the Christian mysteries and Mrs. Besant. It's all splendid. One's never dull for a moment. I can't think how I used to get on before, in the old days. Pleasure, running about, that's all it was. Just running about. Lunch, tea, dinner, theatre, supper every day. It was fun, of course, while it lasted, but there wasn't much left of it afterwards. There's rather a good thing about that in Barbecue Smith's new book. Where is it?" She sat up and reached for a book that was lying on the little table by the head of the sofa. "Do you know him, by the way?" she asked. "Who?" "Mr. Barbecue Smith." Denis knew of him vaguely. Barbecue Smith was a name in the Sunday papers. He wrote about the conduct of life. He might even be the author of What a Young Girl Ought to Know. "No, not personally," he said. "I've invited him for next weekend." She turned over the pages of the book. "Here's the passage I was thinking of. I marked it. I always mark things I like." Holding the book almost at arm's length, for she was somewhat long-sighted, and making suitable gestures with her free hand, she began to read slowly, dramatically. "What are £1,000 fur coats? What are 250,000 incomes?" She looked up from the page with a histrionic movement of the head. Her orange coiffure nodded portentously. Denis looked at it, fascinated. Was it the real thing and henna, he wondered, or was it one of those complete transformations one sees in the advertisements? "What are thrones and sceptres? The orange transformation, yes, it must be a transformation, bobbed up again. What are the gaieties of the rich, the splendours of the powerful? What is the pride of the great? What are the gaudy pleasures of high society?" The voice, which had risen in tone questioningly from sentence to sentence, dropped suddenly and boomed reply. "They are nothing. Vanity, fluff, dandelion seed in the wind, thin vapours of fever. The things that matter happen in the heart. Seen things are sweet, but those unseen are 1,000 times more significant. It is the unseen that counts in life." Mrs. Wimbush lowered the book. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Denis preferred not to hazard an opinion, but uttered a non-committal "Ah, it's a fine book, this, a beautiful book," said Priscilla, as she let the pages flick back one by one from under her thumb. "And here's the passage about the lotus pool. He compares the soul to a lotus pool, you know." She held up the book again and read, "A friend of mine has a lotus pool in his garden. It lies in a little dell embowered with wild roses and eglantine, among which the nightingale pours forth its amorous descant all the summer long. Within the pool the lotuses blossom, and the birds of the air come to drink and bathe themselves in its crystal waters." "Ah, that reminds me," Priscilla exclaimed, shutting the book with a clap and uttering her big profound laugh. "That reminds me of the things that have been going on in our bathing pool since you were here last. We gave the village people leave to come and bathe here in the evenings. You've no idea of the things that happened." She leaned forward, speaking in a confidential whisper. Every now and then she uttered a deep gurgle of laughter. "Mixed bathing. Saw them out of my window. Sent for a pair of field glasses to make sure. No doubt of it." The laughter broke out again. Denis laughed too. Barbecue Smith was tossed on the floor. "It's time we went to see if tea's ready," said Priscilla. She hoisted herself up from the sofa and went swishing off across the room, striding beneath the trailing silk. Denis followed her, faintly humming to himself, "That's why I'm going to sing in opera, sing in opera, sing in opera." And then the little twiddly bit of accompaniment at the end, rah-rah. End of chapter. Chapter 3. The terrace in front of the house was a long, narrow strip of turf. bounded along its outer edge by a graceful stone balustrade. 2 little summer houses of brick stood at either end. Below the house the ground sloped very steeply away, and the terrace was a remarkably high one. From the balusters to the sloping lawn beneath was a drop of 30 feet. Seen from below, the high, unbroken terrace wall, built like the house itself of brick, had the almost menacing aspect of a fortification, a castle bastion from whose parapet one looked out across airy depths to distances level with the eye. Below, in the foreground, hedged in by solid masses of sculptured yew trees, lay the stone-brimmed swimming pool. Beyond it stretched the park with its massive elms, its green expanses of grass, and, at the bottom of the valley, the gleam of the narrow river. On the farther side of the stream the land rose again in a long slope, chequered with cultivation. Looking up the valley to the right, one saw a line of blue, far-off hills. The tea-table had been planted in the shade of one of the little summer-houses, and the rest of the party was already assembled about it when Denis and Priscilla made their appearance. Henry Wimbush had begun to pour the tea. He was one of those ageless, unchanging men on the farther side of 50, who might be 30, who might be anything. Denis had known him almost as long as he could remember. In all those years his pale, rather handsome face had never grown any older. It was like the pale grey bowler hat which he always wore, winter and summer, unageing, calm, serenely without expression. Next to him, but separated from him and from the rest of the world by the almost impenetrable barriers of her deafness, sat Jenny Mullion. She was perhaps 30, had a tilted nose and a pink and white complexion, and wore her brown hair plaited and coiled in 2 lateral buns over her ears. In the secret tower of her deafness she sat apart, looking down at the world through sharply piercing eyes. What did she think of men and women and things? That was something that Denis had never been able to discover. In her enigmatic remoteness, Jenny was a little disquieting. Even now some interior joke seemed to be amusing her, for she was smiling to herself, and her brown eyes were like very bright round marbles. On his other side, the serious, moon-like innocence of Mary Bracegirdle's face shone pink and childish. She was nearly 23, but one wouldn't have guessed it. Her short hair, clipped like a page's, hung in a bell of elastic gold about her cheeks. She had large blue china eyes, whose expression was one of ingenuous and often puzzled earnestness. Next to Mary, a small, gaunt man was sitting, rigid and erect in his chair. In appearance, Mr. Scogan was like one of those extinct bird lizards of the tertiary. His nose was beaked, his dark eyes had the shining quickness of a robin's. But there was nothing soft or gracious or feathery about him. The skin of his wrinkled brown face had a dry and scaly look. His hands were the hands of a crocodile. His movements were marked by the lizard's disconcertingly abrupt clockwork speed. His speech was thin, fluty, and dry. Henry Wimbush, schoolfellow and exact contemporary, Mr. Scogan looked far older and, at the same time, far more youthfully alive than did that gentle aristocrat with the face like a grey bowler. Mr. Scogan might look like an extinct saurian, but Gombauld was altogether and essentially human. In the old-fashioned natural histories of the 30s, he might have figured in a steel engraving as a type of Homo sapiens, an honour which at that time commonly fell to Lord Byron. Indeed, with more hair and less collar, Gombauld would have been completely Byronic. More than Byronic, even, for Gombauld was of Provençal descent, a black-haired young corsair of 30, with flashing teeth and luminous large eyes. Denis looked at him enviously. He was jealous of his talent. If only he wrote verse as well as Gombauld painted pictures. Still more, at the moment, he envied Gombauld his looks, his vitality, his easy confidence of manner. Was it surprising that Anne should like him? Like him? It might even be something worse, Denis reflected bitterly, as he walked at Priscilla's side down the long grass terrace. Between Gombauld and Mr. Scogan, a very much lowered deck-chair presented its back to the new arrivals as they advanced towards the tea-table. Gombauld was leaning over it. His face moved vivaciously. He smiled, he laughed, he made quick gestures with his hands. From the depths of the chair came up a sound of soft, lazy laughter. Denis started as he heard it. That laughter, how well he knew it, what emotions it evoked in him. He quickened his pace. In her low-deck chair, Anne was nearer to lying than to sitting. Her long, slender body reposed in an attitude of listlessness and indolent grace. Within its setting of light brown hair, her face had a pretty regularity that was almost doll-like. And indeed, there were moments when she seemed nothing more than a doll, when the oval face with its long, lashed, pale blue eyes expressed nothing, when it was no more than a lazy mask of wax. She was Henry Wimbush's own niece. That bowler-like countenance was one of the Wimbush heirlooms. It ran in the family, appearing in its female members as a blank, dull face. But across this dollish mask, like a gay melody dancing over an unchanging fundamental bass, passed Anne's other inheritance. Quick laughter, light, ironic amusement, and the changing expression of many moods. She was smiling now as Denis looked down at her. Her cat's smile, he called it, for no very good reason. The mouth was compressed, and on either side of it 2 tiny wrinkles had formed themselves in her cheeks. An infinity of slightly malicious amusement lurked in those little folds, in the puckers above the half-closed eyes, in the eyes themselves, bright and laughing between the narrowed lids. The preliminary greeting spoken, Denis found an empty chair between Gombauld and Jenny and sat down. "How are you, Jenny?" he shouted at her. Jenny nodded and smiled in mysterious silence, as though the subject of her health were a secret that could not be publicly divulged. "How's London been since I went away?" Anne inquired from the depth of her chair. The moment had come. The tremendously amusing narrative was waiting for utterance. "Well," said Denis, smiling happily, "to begin with..." "Has Priscilla told you of our great antiquarian find?" Henry Wimbush leaned forward. The most promising of buds was nipped. "To begin with," said Denis desperately, "there was the ballet. Last week," Mr. Wimbush went on softly and implacably, "we dug up 50 yards of oaken drain-pipes. Just tree trunks with a hole bored through the middle. Very interesting indeed. Whether they were laid down by the monks in the 15th century, or whether..." Denis listened gloomily. "Extraordinary," he said, when Mr. Wimbush had finished. "Quite extraordinary." He helped himself to another slice of cake. He didn't even want to tell his tale about London now. He was damped. For some time past, Mary's grave blue eyes had been fixed upon him. "What have you been writing lately?" she asked. It would be nice to have a little literary conversation. "Oh, verse and prose," said Denis. "Just verse and prose." "Prose?" Mr. Scogan pounced alarmingly on the word. "You've been writing prose?" "Yes." "Not a novel?" "Yes." "My poor Denis," exclaimed Mr. Scogan. "What about?" Denis felt rather uncomfortable. "Oh, about the usual things, you know." "Of course," Mr. Scogan groaned. "I'll describe the plot for you. Little Percy, the hero, was never good at games, but he was always clever. He passes through the usual public school and the usual university, and comes to London, where he lives among the artists. He is bowed down with melancholy thought. He carries the whole weight of the universe upon his shoulders. He writes a novel of dazzling brilliance. He dabbles delicately in amour and disappears, at the end of the book, into the luminous future." Denis blushed scarlet. Mr. Scogan had described the plan of his novel with an accuracy that was appalling. He made an effort to laugh. "You're entirely wrong," he said. "My novel is not in the least like that." It was a heroic lie. Luckily, he reflected, only 2 chapters were written. He would tear them up that very evening when he unpacked. Mr. Scogan paid no attention to his denial, but went on. "Why will you young men continue to write about things that are so entirely uninteresting as the mentality of adolescents and artists? Professional anthropologists might find it interesting to turn sometimes from the beliefs of the blackfellow to the philosophical preoccupations of the undergraduate, but you can't expect an ordinary adult man like myself to be much moved by the story of his spiritual troubles. After all, even in England, even in Germany and Russia, there are more adults than adolescents. As for the artist, he is preoccupied with problems that are so utterly unlike those of the ordinary adult man, problems of pure aesthetics which don't so much as present themselves to people like myself, that a description of his mental processes is as boring to the ordinary reader as a piece of pure mathematics. A serious book about artists regarded as artists is unreadable, and a book about artists regarded as lovers, husbands, dipsomaniacs, heroes and the like is really not worth writing again. Jean-Christophe is the stock artist of literature, just as Professor Radium of Comic Cuts is its stock man of science. "I'm sorry to hear I'm as uninteresting as all that," said Gombold. "Not at all, my dear Gombold," Mr. Scogan hastened to explain. "As a lover or a dipsomaniac, I've no doubt of you being a most fascinating specimen. But as a combiner of forms, you must honestly admit it, you're a bore." "I entirely disagree with you," exclaimed Mary. She was somehow always out of breath when she talked, and her speech was punctuated by little gasps. "I've known a great many artists, and I've always found their mentality very interesting, especially in Paris. Schuplitsky, for example. I saw a great deal of Schuplitsky in Paris this spring." "Ah, but then you're an exception, Mary, you're an exception," said Mr. Scogan. "You are a femme supérieure." A flush of pleasure turned Mary's face into a harvest moon. End of chapter. Chapter 4. Denis woke up next morning to find the sun shining, the sky serene. He decided to wear white flannel trousers and a black jacket with a silk shirt and his new peach-coloured tie. And what shoes? White was the obvious choice, but there was something rather pleasing about the notion of black patent leather. He lay in bed for several minutes considering the problem. Before he went down, patent leather was his final choice. He looked at himself critically in the glass. His hair might have been more golden, he reflected. As it was, its yellowness had the hint of a greenish tinge in it. But his forehead was good. His forehead made up in height what his chin lacked in prominence. His nose might have been longer, but it would pass. His eyes might have been blue and not green. But his coat was very well cut and, discreetly padded, made him seem robuster than he actually was. His legs, in their white casing, were long and elegant. Satisfied, he descended the stairs. Most of the party had already finished their breakfast. He found himself alone with Jenny. "I hope you slept well," he said. "Yes, isn't it lovely?" Jenny replied, giving 2 rapid little nods. "But we had such awful thunderstorms last week." Parallel straight lines, Denis reflected, meet only at infinity. He might talk for ever of care, charmer, sleep, and she of meteorology, till the end of time. Did one ever establish contact with anyone? We are all parallel straight lines. Jenny was only a little more parallel than most. "They are very alarming, these thunderstorms," he said, helping himself to porridge. "Don't you think so? Or are you above being frightened?" "No, I always go to bed in a storm. One is so much safer lying down." "Why?" "Because," said Jenny, making a descriptive gesture, "because lightning goes downwards and not flatways. When you're lying down, you're out of the current." "That's very ingenious." "It's true." There was a silence. Denis finished his porridge and helped himself to bacon. For lack of anything better to say, and because Mr. Scogan's absurd phrase was for some reason running in his head, he turned to Jenny and asked, "Do you consider yourself a femme supérieure?" He had to repeat the question several times before Jenny got the hang of it. "No," she said rather indignantly, when at last she heard what Denis was saying. "Certainly not. Has anyone been suggesting that I am?" "No," said Denis. "Mr. Scogan told Mary she was one." "Did he?" Jenny lowered her voice. "Shall I tell you what I think of that man? I think he's slightly sinister." Having made this pronouncement, she entered the ivory tower of her deafness and closed the door. Denis could not induce her to say anything more, could not induce her even to listen. She just smiled at him, smiled and occasionally nodded. Denis went out onto the terrace to smoke his after-breakfast pipe and to read his morning paper. An hour later, when Anne came down, she found him still reading. By this time he had got to the court circular and the forthcoming weddings. He got up to meet her as she approached, a hamadryad in white muslin, across the grass. "Why, Denis," she exclaimed, "you look perfectly sweet in your white trousers." Denis was dreadfully taken aback. There was no possible retort. "You speak as though I were a child in a new frock," he said, with a show of irritation. "But that's how I feel about you, Denis dear." "Then you oughtn't to." "But I can't help it. I'm so much older than you." "I like that," he said. 4 years older. "And if you do look perfectly sweet in your white trousers, why shouldn't I say so? And why did you put them on if you didn't think you were going to look sweet in them?" "Let's go into the garden," said Denis. He was put out. The conversation had taken such a preposterous and unexpected turn. He had planned a very different opening, in which he was to lead off with, "You look adorable this morning," or something of the kind. And she was to answer, "Do I?" And then there was to be a pregnant silence. And now she had got in first with the trousers. It was provoking. His pride was hurt. That part of the garden that sloped down from the foot of the terrace to the pool had a beauty which did not depend on colour so much as on forms. It was as beautiful by moonlight as in the sun. The silver of water, the dark shapes of yew and ilex trees remained at all hours and seasons the dominant features of the scene. It was a landscape in black and white. For colour there was the flower garden. It lay to one side of the pool, separated from it by a huge Babylonian wall of yews. You passed through a tunnel in the hedge, you opened a wicket in a wall, and you found yourself, startlingly and suddenly, in the world of colour. The July borders blazed and flared under the sun. Within its high brick walls, the garden was like a great tank of warmth and perfume and colour. Denis held open the little iron gate for his companion. "It's like passing from a cloister into an oriental palace," he said, and took a deep breath of the warm, flower-scented air. "In fragrant volleys they let fly..." How does it go? "Well shot, ye firemen, oh how sweet and round your equal fires do meet, whose shrill report no ear can tell, but echoes to the eye and smell." "You have a bad habit of quoting," said Anne. "As I never know the context or author, I find it humiliating." Denis apologised. "It's the fault of one's education. Things somehow seem more real and vivid when one can apply somebody else's ready-made phrase about them. And then there are lots of lovely names and words, monophysite, iamblichus, pomponazzi. You bring them out triumphantly and feel you've clinched the argument with the mere magical sound of them. That's what comes of the higher education." "You may regret your education," said Anne. "I'm ashamed of my lack of it. Look at those sunflowers. Aren't they magnificent? Dark faces and golden crowns. They're the kings of Ethiopia. And I like the way the tits cling to the flowers and pick out the seeds, while the other loutish birds, grubbing dirtily for their food, look up in envy from the ground." "Do they look up in envy?" "That's the literary touch, I'm afraid. Education again. It always comes back to that." He was silent. Anne had sat down on a bench that stood in the shade of an old apple tree. "I'm listening," she said. He did not sit down, but walked backwards and forwards in front of the bench, gesticulating a little as he talked. "Books," he said, "books. One reads so many, and one sees so few people and so little of the world. Great thick books about the universe and the mind and ethics. You've no idea how many there are. I must have read 20 or 30 tons of them in the last 5 years, 20 tons of ratiocination. Weighted with that, one's pushed out into the world." He went on walking up and down. His voice rose, fell, was silent a moment, and then talked on. He moved his hands, sometimes he waved his arms. Anne looked and listened quietly, as though she were at a lecture. He was a nice boy, and today he looked charming. Charming. One entered the world, Denis pursued, having ready-made ideas about everything. One had a philosophy and tried to make life fit into it. One should have lived first and then made one's philosophy to fit life. Life, facts, things were horribly complicated. Ideas, even the most difficult of them, deceptively simple. In the world of ideas, everything was clear. In life, all was obscure, embroiled. Was it surprising that one was miserable, horribly unhappy? Denis came to a halt in front of the bench, and, as he asked this last question, he stretched out his arms and stood for an instant in an attitude of crucifixion, then let them fall again to his sides. My poor Denis! Anne was touched. He was really too pathetic as he stood there in front of her, in his white flannel trousers. But does one suffer about these things? It seems very extraordinary. "You're like Scogan," cried Denis bitterly. "You regard me as a specimen for an anthropologist. Well, I suppose I am." "No, no," she protested, and drew in her skirt with a gesture that indicated that he was to sit down beside her. He sat down. "Why can't you just take things for granted and as they come?" she asked. "It's so much simpler." "Of course it is," said Denis, "but it's a lesson to be learnt gradually. There are 20 tons of ratiocination to be got rid of first." "I've always taken things as they come," said Anne. "It seems so obvious. One enjoys the pleasant things, avoids the nasty ones. There's nothing more to be said." "Nothing, for you. But then you were born a pagan. I am trying laboriously to make myself one. I can take nothing for granted. I can enjoy nothing as it comes along. Beauty, pleasure, art, women. I have to invent an excuse, a justification for everything that's delightful. Otherwise, I can't enjoy it with an easy conscience. I make up a little story about beauty and pretend that it has something to do with truth and goodness. I have to say that art is the process by which one reconstructs the divine reality out of chaos. Pleasure is one of the mystical roads to union with the infinite, the ecstasies of drinking, dancing, love-making. As for women, I am perpetually assuring myself that they're the broad highway to divinity. And to think that I'm only just beginning to see through the silliness of the whole thing. It's incredible to me that anyone should have escaped these horrors." "It's still more incredible to me," said Anne, "that anyone should have been a victim to them. I should like to see myself believing that men are the highway to divinity." The amused malice of her smile planted 2 little folds on either side of her mouth, and through their half-closed lids her eyes shone with laughter. "What you need, Denis, is a nice plump young wife, a fixed income and a little congenial but regular work." "What I need is you." That was what he ought to have retorted. That was what he wanted passionately to say. He could not say it. His desire fought against his shyness. "What I need is you." Mentally he shouted the words, but not a sound issued from his lips. He looked at her despairingly. Couldn't she see what was going on inside him? Couldn't she understand? "What I need is you." He would say it. He would. "I think I shall go and bathe," said Anne. "It's so hot." The opportunity had passed. End of chapter. Chapter 5. Mr. Wimbush had taken them to see the sights of the home farm, and now they were standing, all 6 of them, Henry Wimbush, Mr. Scogan, Denis, Gombold, Anne and Mary, by the low wall of the piggery, looking into one of the sties. "This is a good sow," said Henry Wimbush. "She had a litter of 14. "14," Mary echoed incredulously. She turned astonished blue eyes towards Mr. Wimbush, then let them fall onto the seething mass of élan vital that fermented in the sty. An immense sow reposed on her side in the middle of the pen. Her round black belly, fringed with a double line of dugs, presented itself to the assault of an army of small brownish-black swine. With a frantic greed they tugged at their mother's flank. The old sow stirred, sometimes uneasily, or uttered a little grunt of pain. One small pig, the runt, the weakling of the litter, had been unable to secure a place at the banquet. Squealing shrilly, he ran backwards and forwards, trying to push in amongst his stronger brothers, or even to climb over their tight little black backs toward the maternal reservoir. "There are 14," said Mary. "You're quite right. I counted. It's extraordinary." "The sow next door," Mr. Wimbush went on, "has done very badly. She only had 5 in her litter. I shall give her another chance. If she doesn't do better next time, I shall fat her up and kill her. There's the boar." He pointed towards a farther sty. "Fine old beast, isn't he? But he's getting past his prime. He'll have to go too." "How cruel!" Anne exclaimed. "But how practical, how eminently realistic," said Mr. Scogan. "In this farm we have a model of sound paternal government. Make them breed, make them work, and when they're past working or breeding or begetting, slaughter them." "Farming seems to be mostly indecency and cruelty," said Anne. With the ferrule of his walking-stick, Denis began to scratch the boar's long, bristly back. The animal moved a little, so as to bring himself within easier range of the instrument that evoked in him such delicious sensations. Then he stood stock still, softly grunting his contentment. The mud of years flaked off his sides in a grey, powdery scurf. "What a pleasure it is," said Denis, "to do somebody a kindness. I believe I enjoyed scratching this pig quite as much as he enjoys being scratched. If only one could always be kind with so little expense or trouble." A gate slammed. There was a sound of heavy footsteps. "Morning, Rowley," said Henry Wimbush. "Morning, sir," old Rowley answered. He was the most venerable of the labourers on the farm, a tall, solid man, still unbent, with grey side whiskers and a steep, dignified profile. Grave, weighty in his manner, splendidly respectable, Rowley had the air of a great English statesman of the mid-19th century. He halted on the outskirts of the group, and for a moment they all looked at the pigs in a silence that was only broken by the sound of grunting or the squelch of a sharp hoof in the mire. Rowley turned at last, slowly and ponderously and nobly, as he did everything, and addressed himself to Henry Wimbush. "Look at them, sir," he said, with a motion of his hand towards the wallowing swine. "Rightly is they called pigs." "Rightly indeed," Mr. Wimbush agreed. "I am abashed by that man," said Mr. Scogan, as old Rowley plodded off slowly and with dignity. "What wisdom, what judgment, what a sense of values! Rightly are they called swine. Yes, and I wish I could with as much justice say, rightly are we called men." They walked on towards the cowsheds and the stables of the cart-horses. 5 white geese, taking the air this fine morning, even as they were doing, met them in the way. They hesitated, cackled, then, converting their lifted necks into rigid horizontal snakes, they rushed off in disorder, hissing horribly as they went. Red calves paddled in the dung and mud of a spacious yard. In another enclosure stood the bull, massive as a locomotive. He was a very calm bull, and his face wore an expression of melancholy stupidity. He gazed with reddish-brown eyes at his visitors, chewed thoughtfully at the tangible memories of an earlier meal, swallowed and regurgitated, chewed again. His tail lashed savagely from side to side. It seemed to have nothing to do with his impassive bulk. Between his short horns was a triangle of red curls, short and dense. "Splendid animal," said Henry Wimbush. "Pedigree stock. But he's getting a little old, like the boar." "Fat him up and slaughter him," Mr. Scogan pronounced, with a delicate old maidish precision of utterance. "Couldn't you give the animals a little holiday from producing children?" asked Anne. "I'm so sorry for the poor things." Mr. Wimbush shook his head. "Personally," he said, "I rather like seeing 14 pigs grow where only one grew before. The spectacle of so much crude life is refreshing." "I'm glad to hear you say so," Gumbold broke in warmly. "Lots of life, that's what we want. I like pullulation. Everything ought to increase and multiply as hard as it can." Gombold grew lyrical. Everybody ought to have children. Anne ought to have them. Mary ought to have them. Dozens and dozens. He emphasised his point by thumping with his walking stick on the bull's leather flanks. Mr. Scogan ought to pass on his intelligence to little Scogans and Denis to little Denises. The bull turned his head to see what was happening, regarded the drumming stick for several seconds, then turned back again, satisfied, it seemed, that nothing was happening. Sterility was odious, unnatural, a sin against life. Life, life, and still more life. The ribs of the placid bull resounded. Standing with his back against the farmyard pump, a little apart, Denis examined the group. Gombauld, passionate and vivacious, was its centre. The others stood around, listening. Henry Wimbush, calm and polite beneath his grey bowler. Mary, with parted lips and eyes that shone with the indignation of a convinced birth-controller. Anne looked on through half-shut eyes, smiling, and beside her stood Mr. Scogan, bolt upright in an attitude of metallic rigidity that contrasted strangely with that fluid grace of hers, which even in stillness suggested a soft movement. Gombauld ceased talking, and Mary, flushed and outraged, opened her mouth to refute him. But she was too slow. Before she could utter a word, Mr. Scogan's fluty voice had pronounced the opening phrases of a discourse. There was no hope of getting so much as a word in edgeways. Mary had perforce to resign herself. "Even your eloquence, my dear Gombauld," he was saying, "even your eloquence must prove inadequate to reconvert the world to a belief in the delights of mere multiplication. With the gramophone, the cinema, and the automatic pistol, the goddess of applied science has presented the world with another gift, more precious even than these, the means of dissociating love from propagation. Eros, for those who wish it, is now an entirely free god. His deplorable association with Lucina may be broken at will. In the course of the next few centuries, who knows, the world may see a more complete severance. I look forward to it optimistically. Where the great Erasmus Darwin and Miss Anna Seward, Swan of Lichfield, experimented, and, for all their scientific ardour, failed, our descendants will experiment and succeed. An impersonal generation will take the place of nature's hideous system. In vast state incubators, rows upon rows of gravid bottles will supply the world with the population it requires. The family system will disappear. Society, sapped at its very base, will have to find new foundations. And Eros, beautifully and irresponsibly free, will flit like a gay butterfly from flower to flower through a sunlit world." "It sounds lovely," said Anne. "The distant future always does." Mary's china-blue eyes, more serious and more astonished than ever, were fixed on Mr. Scogan. "Bottles," she said. "Do you really think so? Bottles?" End of chapter. Chapter 6. Mr. Barbecue Smith arrived in time for tea on Saturday afternoon. He was a short and corpulent man with a very large head and no neck. In his earlier middle age he had been distressed by this absence of neck, but was comforted by reading in Balzac's Louis Lambert that all the world's great men have been marked by the same peculiarity, and for a simple and obvious reason. Greatness is nothing more nor less than the harmonious functioning of the faculties of the head and heart. The shorter the neck, the more closely these two organs approach one another. Argal, it was convincing. Mr. Barbecue Smith belonged to the old school of journalists. He sported a leonine head, with a greyish-black mane of oddly unappetising hair, brushed back from a broad but low forehead. And somehow he always seemed slightly, ever so slightly, soiled. In younger days he had gaily called himself a bohemian. He did so no longer. He was a teacher now, a kind of prophet. Some of his books of comfort and spiritual teaching were in their 120th thousand. Priscilla received him with every mark of esteem. He had never been to Crome before. She showed him around the house. Mr. Barbecue Smith was full of admiration. So quaint, so old world, he kept repeating. He had a rich, rather unctuous voice. Priscilla praised his latest book. "Splendid, I thought it was," she said in her large, jolly way. "I'm happy to think you found it a comfort," said Mr. Barbecue-Smith. "Oh, tremendously. And the bit about the lotus pool, I thought that so beautiful." "I knew you would like that. It came to me, you know, from without." He waved his hand to indicate the astral world. They went out into the garden for tea. Mr. Barbecue-Smith was duly introduced. "Mr. Stone is a writer too," said Priscilla as she introduced Denis. "Indeed?" Mr. Barbecue-Smith smiled benignly, and looking up at Denis with an expression of Olympian condescension. "And what sort of things do you write?" Denis was furious, and, to make matters worse, he felt himself blushing hotly. Had Priscilla no sense of proportion? She was putting them in the very same category, Barbecue-Smith and himself. They were both writers, they both used pen and ink. To Mr. Barbecue-Smith's question he answered, "Oh, nothing much, nothing," and looked away. "Mr. Stone is one of our younger poets." It was Anne's voice. He scowled at her, and she smiled back exasperatingly. "Excellent, excellent," said Mr. Barbecue-Smith, and he squeezed Denis' arm encouragingly. "The Bard's is a noble calling." As soon as tea was over, Mr. Barbecue-Smith excused himself. He had to do some writing before dinner. Priscilla quite understood. The prophet retired to his chamber. Mr. Barbecue-Smith came down to the drawing-room at 7:50. He was in a good humour, and, as he descended the stairs, he smiled to himself and rubbed his large white hands together. In the drawing-room, someone was playing softly and ramblingly on the piano. He wondered who it could be. One of the young ladies, perhaps. But no, it was only Denis, who got up hurriedly and with some embarrassment as he came into the room. Do go on," said Mr. Barbecue-Smith. "I'm very fond of music." "Then I couldn't possibly go on," Denis replied. "I only make noises." There was a silence. Mr. Barbecue-Smith stood with his back to the hearth, warming himself at the memory of last winter's fires. He could not control his interior satisfaction, but still went on smiling to himself. At last he turned to Denis. "You write," he asked, "don't you?" "Well, yes, a little, you know." "How many words do you find you can write in an hour?" "I don't think I've ever counted." "Oh, you ought to, you ought to. It's most important." Denis exercised his memory. "When I'm in good form," he said, "I fancy I do a 1,200-word review in about 4 hours. But sometimes it takes much longer." Mr. Barbecue-Smith nodded. "Yes, 300 words an hour at your best." He walked out into the middle of the room, turned round on his heels and confronted Denis again. "Guess how many words I wrote this evening between 5 and 7:30. "I can't imagine." "No, but you must guess. Between 5 and 7:30, that's 2.5 hours. 1,200 words," Denis hazarded. No. Mr. Barbecue-Smith's expanded face shone with gaiety. "Try again." 1,500. No. "I give it up," said Denis. He found he couldn't summon up much interest in Mr. Barbecue-Smith's writing. "Well, I'll tell you. 3,800. Denis opened his eyes. "You must get a lot done in a day," he said. Mr. Barbecue-Smith suddenly became extremely confidential. He pulled up a stool to the side of Denis' arm-chair, sat down in it, and began to talk softly and rapidly. "Listen to me," he said, laying his hand on Denis' sleeve. "You want to make your living by writing. You're young, you're inexperienced. Let me give you a little sound advice." What was the fellow going to do, Denis wondered? Give him an introduction to the editor of John o' London's Weekly? Or tell him where he could sell a light middle for 7 guineas? Mr. Barbecue-Smith patted his arm several times and went on. "The secret of writing," he said, breathing it into the young man's ear, "the secret of writing is inspiration." Denis looked at him in astonishment. "Inspiration," Mr. Barbecue-Smith repeated. "You mean the native wood-note business?" Mr. Barbecue Smith nodded. "Oh, then I entirely agree with you," said Denis. "But what if one hasn't got inspiration?" "That was precisely the question I was waiting for," said Mr. Barbecue Smith. "You ask me what one should do if one hasn't got inspiration. I answer, you have inspiration. Everyone has inspiration. It's simply a question of getting it to function." The clock struck 8. There was no sign of any of the other guests. Everybody was always late at Crome. Mr. Barbecue Smith went on. "That's my secret," he said. "I give it you freely." Denis made a suitably grateful murmur and grimace. "I'll help you to find your inspiration, because I don't like to see a nice, steady young man like you exhausting his vitality and wasting the best years of his life in a grinding intellectual labour that could be completely obviated by inspiration. I did it myself, so I know what it's like. Up till the time I was 38, I was a writer like you, a writer without inspiration. All I wrote I squeezed out of myself by sheer hard work. Why, in those days I was never able to do more than 650 words an hour, and what's more, I often didn't sell what I wrote," he sighed. "We artists," he said parenthetically, "we intellectuals aren't much appreciated here in England." Denis wondered if there was any method, consistent of course with politeness, by which he could dissociate himself from Mr. Barbecue Smith's "we." There was none, and besides, it was too late now, for Mr. Barbecue Smith was once more pursuing the tenor of his discourse. "At 38, I was a poor, struggling, tired, overworked, unknown journalist. Now, at 50..." He paused modestly and made a little gesture, moving his fat hands outwards, away from one another, and expanding his fingers as though in demonstration. He was exhibiting himself. Denis thought of that advertisement of Nestle's milk. The two cats on the wall under the moon, one black and thin, the other white, sleek and fat. Before inspiration and after. "Inspiration has made the difference," said Mr. Barbecue Smith solemnly. "It came quite suddenly, like a gentle dew from heaven." He lifted his hand and let it fall back onto his knee to indicate the descent of the dew. "It was one evening. I was writing my first little book about the conduct of life, Humble Heroisms. You may have read it. It has been a comfort, at least I hope and think so, a comfort to many thousands. I was in the middle of the second chapter, and I was stuck. I sat biting the end of my pen and looking at the electric light which hung above my table, a little above and in front of me." He indicated the position of the lamp with elaborate care. "Have you ever looked at a bright light intently for a long time?" he asked, turning to Denis. Denis didn't think he had. "You can hypnotise yourself that way," Mr. Barbecue Smith went on. The gong sounded in a terrific crescendo from the hall. Still no sign of the others. Denis was horribly hungry. "That's what happened to me," said Mr. Barbecue Smith. "I was hypnotised. I lost consciousness like that." He snapped his fingers. "When I came to, I found that it was past midnight, and I had written 4,000 words. 4,000, he repeated, opening his mouth very wide on the ow of thousand. Inspiration had come to me. "What a very extraordinary thing," said Denis. "I was afraid of it at first. It didn't seem to me natural. I didn't feel, somehow, that it was quite right, quite fair, I might almost say, to produce a literary composition unconsciously. Besides, I was afraid I might have written nonsense." "And had you written nonsense?" Denis asked. "Certainly not," Mr. Barbecue Smith replied, with a trace of annoyance. "Certainly not. It was admirable. Just a few spelling mistakes and slips, such as there generally are in automatic writing. But the style, the thought, all the essentials were admirable. After that, inspiration came to me regularly. I wrote the whole of Humble Heroisms like that. It was a great success, and so has everything been that I have written since." He leaned forward and jabbed at Denis with his finger. "That's my secret," he said. "And that's how you could write too, if you tried, without effort, fluently, well." "But how?" asked Denis, trying not to show how deeply he had been insulted by that final "well." by cultivating your inspiration, by getting into touch with your subconscious. Have you ever read my little book, Pipelines to the Infinite? Denis had to confess that that was precisely one of the few, perhaps the only one, of Mr. Barbecue Smith's works he had not read. Never mind, said Mr. Barbecue Smith. It's just a little book about the connection of the subconscious with the infinite. Get into touch with the subconscious, and you're in touch with the universe. Inspiration, in fact. You follow me? Perfectly, said Denis. But don't you find that the universe sometimes sends you very irrelevant messages? I don't allow it to, Mr. Barbecue Smith replied. I canalise it, I bring it down through pipes to work the turbines of my conscious mind. Like Niagara, Denis suggested. Some of Mr. Barbecue Smith's remarks sounded strangely like quotations. Quotations from his own works, no doubt. Precisely, like Niagara. And this is how I do it. He leaned forward and, with a raised forefinger, marked his points as he made them, beating time, as it were, to his discourse. Before I go off into my trance, I concentrate on the subject I wish to be inspired about. Let us say I am writing about the humble heroisms. For 10 minutes before I go into the trance, I think of nothing but orphans supporting their little brothers and sisters, of dull work well and patiently done, and I focus my mind on such great philosophical truths as the purification and uplifting of the soul by suffering, and the alchemical transformation of leaden evil into golden good. Denis again hung up his little festoon of quotation marks. Then I pop off. 2 or 3 hours later I wake up again and find that inspiration has done its work. Thousands of words, comforting, uplifting words, lie before me. I type them out neatly on my machine and they are ready for the printer. It all sounds wonderfully simple, said Denis. It is. All great and splendid and divine things of life are wonderfully simple. Quotation marks again. When I have to do my aphorisms, Mr. Barbecue Smith continued, I prelude my trance by turning over the pages of any dictionary of quotations or Shakespeare calendar that comes to hand. That sets the key, so to speak. That ensures that the universe shall come flowing in, not in a continuous rush, but in aphorismic drops. Do you see the idea? Denis nodded. Mr. Barbecue Smith put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a notebook. I did a few in the train today, he said, turning over the pages. Just dropped off into a trance in the corner of my carriage. I find the train very conducive to good work. Here they are. He cleared his throat and... The mountain road may be steep, but the air is pure up there, and it is from the summit that one gets the view. The things that really matter happen in the heart. It was curious, Denis reflected, the way the infinite sometimes repeated itself. Seeing is believing, yes, but believing is also seeing. If I believe in God, I see God, even in the things that seem to be evil. Mr. Barbecue Smith looked up from his notebook. That last one, he said, is particularly subtle and beautiful, don't you think? Without inspiration, I could never have hit on that. He reread the apothegm with a slower and more solemn utterance. Straight from the infinite, he commented reflectively, then addressed himself to the next aphorism. The flame of a candle gives light, but it also burns. Puzzled wrinkles appeared on Mr. Barbecue Smith's forehead. I don't exactly know what that means, he said. It's very gnomic. One could apply it, of course, to the higher education, illuminating but provoking the lower classes to discontent and revolution. Yes, I suppose that's what it is, but it's gnomic. It's gnomic. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The gong sounded again, clamorously. It seemed imploringly. Dinner was growing cold. It roused Mr. Barbecue Smith from meditation. He turned to Denis. You understand me now when I advise you to cultivate your inspiration. Let your subconscious work for you. Turn on the Niagara of the infinite. There was a sound of feet on the stairs. Mr. Barbecue Smith got up, laid his hand for an instant on Denis's shoulder and said, No more now. Another time. And remember, I rely absolutely on your discretion in this matter. There are intimate, sacred things that one doesn't wish to be generally known. Of course, said Denis. I quite understand. End of chapter. Chapter 7. At Crome, all the beds were ancient, hereditary pieces of furniture. Huge beds, like four-masted ships with furled sails of shining coloured stuff. Beds carved and inlaid, beds painted and gilded, beds of walnut and oak, of rare exotic woods. Beds of every date and fashion, from the time of Sir Ferdinando, who built the house, to the time of his namesake in the late 18th century, the last of the family, but all of them grandiose, magnificent. The finest of all was now Anne's bed. Sir Julius, son to Sir Ferdinando, had had it made in Venice against his wife's first lying in. Early Seicento Venice had expended all its extravagant art in the making of it. The body of the bed was like a great square sarcophagus. Clustering roses were carved in high relief on its wooden panels, and luscious putty wallowed among the roses. On the black groundwork of the panels the carved reliefs were gilded and burnished, the golden roses twined in spirals up the four pillar-like posts, and cherubs seated at the top of each column supported a wooden canopy fretted with the same carved flowers. Anne was reading in bed. 2 candles stood on the little table beside her. In their rich light on her face, her bare arm and shoulder took on warm hues and a sort of peach-like quality of surface. Here and there, in the canopy above her, carved golden petals shone brightly among profound shadows, and the soft light, falling on the sculptured panel of the bed, broke restlessly among the intricate roses, lingered in a broad caress on the blown cheeks, the dimpled bellies, the tight, absurd little posteriors of the sprawling putty. There was a discreet tap at the door. She looked up. "Come in, come in." A face, round and childish, within its sleek bell of golden hair, peered around the opening door. More childish-looking still, a suit of mauve pyjamas made its entrance. It was Mary. "I thought I'd just look in for a moment to say good night," she said, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Anne closed her book. "That was very sweet of you. What are you reading?" She looked at the book. "Rather second-rate, isn't it?" The tone in which Mary pronounced the word second-rate implied an almost infinite denigration. She was accustomed in London to associate only with first-rate people who liked first-rate things, and she knew that there were very, very few first-rate things in the world, and that those were mostly French. "Well, I'm afraid I like it," said Anne. There was nothing more to be said. The silence that followed was a rather uncomfortable one. Mary fiddled uneasily with the bottom button of her pyjama jacket. Leaning back on her mound of heaped-up pillows, Anne waited and wondered what was coming. "I'm so awfully afraid of repressions," said Mary at last, bursting suddenly and surprisingly into speech. She pronounced the words on the tail end of an expiring breath, and had to gasp for new air almost before the phrase was finished. "What's there to be depressed about?" "I said repressions, not depressions." "Oh, repressions, I see," said Anne. "But repressions of what?" Mary had to explain. "The natural instincts of sex," she began didactically. But Anne cut her short. Yes, perfectly. I understand. Repressions. Old maids and all the rest. But what about them?" "That's just it," said Mary. "I'm afraid of them. It's always dangerous to repress one's instincts. I'm beginning to detect in myself symptoms like the ones you read of in the books. I constantly dream that I'm falling down wells. And sometimes I even dream that I'm climbing up ladders. It's most disquieting. The symptoms are only too clear." "Are they? One may become a nymphomaniac if one's not careful. You've no idea how serious these repressions are if you don't get rid of them in time." "It sounds too awful," said Anne, "but I don't see that I can do anything to help you." "I thought I'd just like to talk it over with you." "Why, of course. I'm only too happy, Mary darling." Mary coughed and drew a deep breath. "I presume," she began sententiously, "I presume we may take for granted that an intelligent young woman of 23, who has lived in civilised society in the 20th century, has no prejudices." "Well, I confess I still have a few." "But not about repressions." "No, not many about repressions, that's true. Or rather, about getting rid of repressions. Exactly. "So much for our fundamental postulate," said Mary. Solemnity was expressed in every feature of her round young face, radiated from her large blue eyes. "We come next to the desirability of possessing experience. I hope we are agreed that knowledge is desirable and that ignorance is undesirable." Obedient as one of those complacent disciples from whom Socrates could get whatever answer he chose, Anne gave her assent to this proposition. "And we are equally agreed, I hope, that marriage is what it is." "It is." "Good," said Mary. "And repressions being what they are, exactly." There would therefore seem to be only one conclusion. "But I knew that," Anne exclaimed, "before you began." "Yes, but now it's been proved," said Mary. "One must do things logically. The question is now..." "But where does the question come in? You've reached your only possible conclusion logically, which is more than I could have done. All that remains is to impart the information to someone you like, someone you really like rather a lot, someone you're in love with, if I may express myself so badly." "But that's just where the question comes in," Mary exclaimed. "I'm not in love with anybody." "Then, if I were you, I should wait till you are." "But I can't go on dreaming night after night that I'm falling down a well. It's too dangerous." "Well, if it really is too dangerous, then of course you must do something about it. You must find somebody else." "But who?" A thoughtful frown puckered Mary's brow. "It must be somebody intelligent, somebody with intellectual interests that I can share. And it must be somebody with a proper respect for women, somebody who's prepared to talk seriously about his work and his ideas and about my work and my ideas. It isn't, as you see, at all easy to find the right person." "Well," said Anne, "there are 3 unattached and intelligent men in the house at the present time. There's Mr. Scogan, to begin with, but perhaps he's rather too much of a genuine antique. And there are Gombauld and Denis. Shall we say that the choice is limited to the last 2? Mary nodded. "I think we'd better," she said, and then hesitated with a certain air of embarrassment. "What is it?" "I was wondering," said Mary with a gasp, "whether they really were unattached. I thought that perhaps you might... "It was very nice of you to think of me, Mary darling," said Anne, smiling the tight cat's smile. "But as far as I'm concerned, they are both entirely unattached." "I'm very glad of that," said Mary, looking relieved. "We're now confronted with the question, which of the 2? I can give no advice. It is a matter of your taste." "It's not a matter of my taste," Mary pronounced, "but of their merits. We must weigh them and consider them carefully and dispassionately." "You must do the weighing yourself," said Anne. There was still the trace of a smile at the corners of her mouth and round half-closed eyes. "I won't run the risk of advising you wrongly." "Gombauld has more talent," Mary began, "but he is less civilised than Denis." Mary's pronunciation of civilised gave the word a special and additional significance. She uttered it meticulously, in the very front of her mouth, hissing delicately on the opening sibilant. So few people were civilised, and they, like the first-rate works of art, were mostly French. Civilisation is most important, don't you think? Anne held up her hand. "I won't advise," she said. "You must make the decision." "Gombauld's family," Mary went on reflectively, "comes from Marseille. Rather a dangerous heredity when one thinks of the Latin attitude towards women. But then I sometimes wonder whether Denis is altogether serious-minded, whether he isn't rather a dilettante. It's very difficult. What do you think?" "I'm not listening," said Anne. "I refuse to take any responsibility." Mary sighed. "Well," she said, "I think I'd better go to bed and think about it." "Carefully and dispassionately," said Anne. At the door Mary turned round. "Good night," she said, and wondered as she said the words why Anne was smiling in that curious way. It was probably nothing, she reflected. Anne often smiled for no apparent reason. It was probably just a habit. "I hope I shan't dream of falling down wells again tonight," she added. "Ladders are worse," said Anne. Mary nodded. "Yes, ladders are much graver." End of chapter. Chapter 8. Breakfast on Sunday morning was an hour later than on weekdays, and Priscilla, who usually made no public appearance before luncheon, honoured it with her presence. Dressed in black silk, with a ruby cross as well as her customary ring of pearls round her neck, she presided. An enormous Sunday paper concealed all but the extreme pinnacle of her coiffure from the outer world. "I see Surrey has won," she said, with her mouth full, "by 4 wickets. The sun is in Leo, that would account for it." "Splendid game, cricket," remarked Mr. Barbecue-Smith heartily to no one in particular. "So thoroughly English." Jenny, who was sitting next to him, woke up suddenly with a start. "What?" she said. "What?" "So English," repeated Mr. Barbecue-Smith. Jenny looked at him, surprised. "English? Of course I am." He was beginning to explain when Mrs. Wimbush veiled her Sunday paper and appeared, a square, mauve, powdered face in the midst of orange splendours. "I see there's a new series of articles on the next world just beginning," she said to Mr. Barbecue-Smith. "This one's called Summerland and Gehenna." "Summerland," echoed Mr. Barbecue-Smith, closing his eyes. "Summerland, a beautiful name. Beautiful, beautiful." Mary had taken the seat next to Denis. After a night of careful consideration, she had decided on Denis. He might have less talent than Gombold, he might be a little lacking in seriousness, but somehow he was safer. "Are you writing much poetry here in the country?" she asked, with a bright gravity. "None," said Denis curtly. "I haven't brought my typewriter." "But do you mean to say you can't write without a typewriter?" Denis shook his head. He hated talking at breakfast, and besides, he wanted to hear what Mr. Scogan was saying at the other end of the table. "My scheme for dealing with the Church," Mr. Scogan was saying, "is beautifully simple. At the present time, the Anglican clergy wear their collars the wrong way round. I would compel them to wear not only their collars, but all their clothes turned back to front. Coat, waistcoat, trousers, boots, so that every clergyman should present to the world a smooth facade, unbroken by stud, button or lace. The enforcement of such a livery would act as a wholesome deterrent to those intending to enter the Church. At the same time, it would enormously enhance what Archbishop Laud so rightly insisted on, the beauty of holiness, in the few incorrigibles who could not be deterred." "In hell, it seems," said Priscilla, reading in her Sunday paper, "the children amuse themselves by flaying lambs alive." "Ah, but, dear lady, that's only a symbol," exclaimed Mr. Barbecue-Smith, "a material symbol of a spiritual truth. Lambs signify..." "Then there are military uniforms," Mr. Scogan went on. "When scarlet and pipe-clay were abandoned for khaki, there were some who trembled for the future of war. But then, finding how elegant the new tunic was, how closely it clipped the waist, how voluptuously, with the lateral bustles of the pockets, it exaggerated the hips, when they realised the brilliant potentialities of breeches and top-boots, they were reassured. Abolish these military elegances, standardise a uniform of sackcloth and mackintosh. You will very soon find that..." "Is anyone coming to church with me this morning?" asked Henry Wimbush. No one responded. He baited his bare invitation. "I read the lessons, you know, and there's Mr. Bodyham. His sermons are sometimes worth hearing." Thank you," said Barbecue-Smith. "I, for one, prefer to worship in the infinite church of nature. How does our Shakespeare put it? Sermons in books, stones in running brooks." He waved his arm in a fine gesture towards the window, and even as he did so he became vaguely, but none the less insistently, none the less uncomfortably aware that something had gone wrong with the quotation. Something... what could it be? Sermons, stones, books... End of chapter. Chapter 9. Mr. Bodyham was sitting in his study at the rectory. The 19th-century Gothic windows, narrow and pointed, admitted the light grudgingly. In spite of the brilliant July weather, the room was sombre. Brown, varnished bookshelves lined the walls, filled with row upon row of those thick, heavy theological works which the second-hand booksellers generally sell by weight. The mantelpiece, the overmantel, a towering structure of spindly pillars and little shelves, were brown and varnished. The writing desk was brown and varnished, so were the chairs, so was the door. A dark red-brown carpet with patterns covered the floor. Everything was brown in the room, and there was a curious brownish smell. In the midst of this brown gloom, Mr. Bodyham sat at his desk. He was the man in the iron mask, a grey, metallic face with iron cheekbones and a narrow iron brow. Iron folds, hard and unchanging, ran perpendicularly down his cheeks. His nose was the iron beak of some thin, delicate bird of rapine. He had brown eyes set in sockets rimmed with iron. Round them the skin was dark, as though it had been charred. Dense, wiry hair covered his skull. It had been black, it was turning grey. His ears were very small and fine. His jaws, his chin, his upper lip were dark, iron dark, where he had shaved. His voice, when he spoke, and especially when he raised it in preaching, was harsh, like the grating of iron hinges when a seldom-used door is opened. It was nearly 12:30. He had just come back from church, hoarse and weary with preaching. He preached with fury, with passion, an iron man beating with a flail upon the souls of his congregation. But the souls of the faithful at Crome were made of india rubber, solid rubber. The flail rebounded. They were used to Mr. Bodyham at Crome. The flail thumped on india rubber, and as often as not the rubber slept. That morning he had preached, as he had often preached before, on the nature of God. He had tried to make them understand about God what a fearful thing it was to fall into his hands. God, they thought of something soft and merciful. They blinded themselves to facts. Still more, they blinded themselves to the Bible. The passengers on the Titanic sang, "Nearer, my God, to thee," as the ship was going down. Did they realise what they were asking to be brought nearer to? A white fire of righteousness, an angry fire. When Savonarola preached, men sobbed and groaned aloud. Nothing broke the polite silence with which Crome listened to Mr. Bodyham. Only an occasional cough, and sometimes the sound of heavy breathing. In the front pew sat Henry Wimbush, calm, well-bred, beautifully dressed. There were times when Mr. Bodyham wanted to jump down from the pulpit and shake him into life, times when he would have liked to beat and kill his whole congregation. He sat at his desk dejectedly. Outside the Gothic windows the earth was warm and marvellously calm. Everything was as it had always been, and yet, it was nearly 4 years now since he had preached that sermon on Matthew 24:7. "For nation shall rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places." It was nearly 4 years. He had had the sermon printed. It was so terribly, so vitally important that all the world should know what he had to say. A copy of the little pamphlet lay on his desk, 8 small grey pages, printed by a fount of type that had grown blunt, like an old dog's teeth, by the endless champing and champing of the press. He opened it and began to read it yet once again. "For nation shall rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places." 19 centuries have elapsed since our Lord gave utterance to those words, and not a single one of them has been without wars, plagues, famines, and earthquakes. Mighty empires have crashed in ruin to the ground. Diseases have unpeopled half the globe. There have been vast natural cataclysms in which thousands have been overwhelmed by flood and fire and whirlwind. Time and again, in the course of these 19 centuries, such things have happened, but they have not brought Christ back to earth. They were signs of the times, inasmuch as they were signs of God's wrath against the chronic wickedness of mankind. But they were not signs of the times in connection with the second coming. If earnest Christians have regarded the present war as a true sign of the Lord's approaching return, it is not merely because it happens to be a great war involving the lives of millions of people, not merely because famine is tightening its grip on every country in Europe, not merely because disease of every kind, from syphilis to spotted fever, is rife among the warring nations. No, it is not for these reasons that we regard this war as a true sign of the times, but because in its origin and its progress it is marked by certain characteristics which seem to connect it almost beyond a doubt with the predictions in Christian prophecy relating to the second coming of the Lord. Let me enumerate the features of the present war which most clearly suggest that it is a sign foretelling the near approach of the second advent. Our Lord said that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Although it would be presumptuous for us to say what degree of evangelization will be regarded by God as sufficient, we may at least confidently hope that a century of unflagging missionary work has brought the fulfilment of this condition at any rate near. True, the larger number of the world's inhabitants have remained deaf to the preaching of the true religion, but that does not vitiate the fact that the gospel has been preached. For a witness to all unbelievers from the Papist to the Zulu, the responsibility for the continued prevalence of unbelief lies not with the preachers, but with those preached to. Again, it has been generally recognized that the drying up of the waters of the great river Euphrates, mentioned in the 16th chapter of Revelation, refers to the decay and extinction of Turkish power, and is a sign of the near approaching end of the world as we know it. The capture of Jerusalem and the successes in Mesopotamia are great strides forward in the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, though it must be admitted that the Gallipoli episode proved that the Turk still possesses a notable horn of strength. Historically speaking, this drying up of Ottoman power has been going on for the past century. The last 2 years have witnessed a great acceleration of the process, and there can be no doubt that complete desiccation is within sight. Closely following on the words concerning the drying up of the Euphrates comes the prophecy of Armageddon, that world war with which the second coming is to be so closely associated. Once begun, the world war can end only with the return of Christ, and his coming will be sudden and unexpected, like that of a thief in the night. Let us examine the facts. In history, exactly as in St. Paul's Gospel, the world war is immediately preceded by the drying up of the Euphrates, or the decay of Turkish power. This fact alone would be enough to connect the present conflict with the Armageddon of Revelation, and therefore to point to the near approach of the second advent. But further evidence of an even more solid and convincing nature can be adduced. Armageddon is brought about by the activities of 3 unclean spirits, as it were toads, which come out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. If we can identify these 3 powers of evil, much light will clearly be thrown on the whole question. The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet can all be identified in history. Satan, who can only work through human agency, has used these 3 powers in the long war against Christ, which has filled the last 19 centuries with religious strife. The dragon, it has been sufficiently established, is pagan Rome, and the spirit issuing from its mouth is the spirit of infidelity. The beast, alternatively symbolized as a woman, is undoubtedly the papal power, and popery is the spirit which it spews forth. There is only one power which answers to the description of the false prophet, the wolf in sheep's clothing, the agent of the devil working in the guise of the lamb, and that power is the so-called Society of Jesus. The spirit that issues from the mouth of the false prophet is the spirit of false morality. We may assume, then, that the 3 evil spirits are infidelity, popery, and false morality. Have these 3 influences been the real cause of the present conflict? The answer is clear. The spirit of infidelity is the very spirit of German criticism. The high criticism, as it is mockingly called, denies the possibility of miracles, prediction, and real inspiration, and attempts to account for the Bible as a natural development. Slowly but surely, during the last 80 years, the spirit of infidelity has been robbing the Germans of their Bible and their faith, so that Germany is today a nation of unbelievers. Higher criticism has thus made the war possible, for it would be absolutely impossible for any Christian nation to wage war as Germany is waging it. We come next to the spirit of popery, whose influence in causing the war was quite as great as that of infidelity, though not, perhaps, so immediately obvious. Since the Franco-Prussian War, the papal power has steadily declined in France, while in Germany it has steadily increased. Today, France is an anti-papal state, while Germany possesses a powerful Roman Catholic minority. Two papally controlled states, Germany and Austria, are at war with 6 anti-papal states, England, France, Italy, Russia, Serbia and Portugal. Belgium is, of course, a thoroughly papal state, and there can be little doubt that the presence on the Allies' side of an element so essentially hostile has done much to hamper the righteous cause and is responsible for our comparative ill success. That the spirit of popery is behind the war is thus seen clearly enough in the grouping of the opposed powers, while the rebellion in the Roman Catholic parts of Ireland has merely confirmed a conclusion already obvious to any unbiased mind. The spirit of false morality has played as great a part in this war as the 2 other evil spirits. The scrap of paper incident is the nearest and most obvious example of Germany's adherence to this essentially unchristian or Jesuitical morality. The end is German world power, and in the attainment of this end any means are justifiable. It is the true principle of Jesuitry applied to international politics. The identification is now complete. As was predicted in Revelation, the 3 evil spirits have gone forth just as the decay of the Ottoman power was nearing completion, and have joined together to make the world war. The warning, "Behold, I come as a thief," is therefore meant for the present period, for you and me and all the world. This war will lead on inevitably to the war of Armageddon, and will only be brought to an end by the Lord's personal return. And when he returns, what will happen? Those who are in Christ, St. John tells us, will be called to the supper of the Lamb. Those who are found fighting against him will be called to the supper of the great God, that grim banquet where they shall not feast, but be feasted on. For, as St. John says, I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried in a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together into the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bound, both small and great. All the enemies of Christ will be slain with the sword of him that sits upon the horse, and all the fowls will be filled with their flesh. That is the supper of the great God. It may be soon, or it may, as men reckon time, be long, but sooner or later, inevitably, the Lord will come and deliver the world from its present troubles. And woe unto them who are called, not to the supper of the Lamb, but to the supper of the great God. They will realize then, but too late, that God is a God of wrath as well as a God of forgiveness. The God who sent bears to devour the mockers of Elisha, the God who smote the Egyptians for their stubborn wickedness, will assuredly smite them too, unless they make haste to repent. But perhaps it is already too late. Who knows but that tomorrow, in a moment even, Christ may be upon us unawares, like a thief. In a little while, who knows? The angel, standing in the sun, may be summoning the ravens and vultures from their crannies in the rocks, to feed upon the putrefying flesh of the millions of unrighteous, whom God's wrath has destroyed. Be ready then. The coming of the Lord is at hand. May it be for all of you an object of hope, not a moment to look forward to with terror and trembling. Mr. Bodiham closed the little pamphlet and leaned back in his chair. The argument was sound, absolutely compelling, and yet it was 4 years since he had preached that sermon. 4 years, and England was at peace. The sun shone, the people of Crome were as wicked and indifferent as ever. More so, indeed, if that were possible. If only he could understand, if the heavens would but make a sign. But his questionings remained unanswered. Seated there in his brown, varnished chair, under the Ruskinian window, he could have screamed aloud. He gripped the arms of his chair, gripping for control. The knuckles of his hands whitened. He bit his lip. In a few seconds he was able to relax the tension. He began to rebuke himself for his rebellious impatience. 4 years, he reflected. What were 4 years after all? It must inevitably take a long time for Armageddon to ripen, to yeast itself up. The episode of 1914 had been a preliminary skirmish. And as for the war having come to an end, why, that of course was illusory. It was still going on, smouldering away in Silesia, in Ireland, in Anatolia. The discontent in Egypt and India was preparing the way, perhaps, for a great extension of the slaughter among the heathen peoples. The Chinese boycott of Japan and the rivalries of that country and America in the Pacific might be breeding a great new war in the East. The prospect, Mr. Bodiham tried to assure himself, was hopeful. The real, the genuine Armageddon might soon begin, and then, like a thief in the night. But in spite of all his comfortable reasoning, he remained unhappy, dissatisfied. 4 years ago he had been so confident. God's intention seemed then so plain. And now he did well to be angry. And now he suffered too. Sudden and silent as a phantom, Mrs. Bodiham appeared, gliding noiselessly across the room. Above her black dress, her face was pale with an opaque whiteness. Her eyes were pale as water in a glass, and her strawy hair was almost colourless. She held a large envelope in her hand. "This came for you by the post," she said softly. The envelope was unsealed. Mechanically, Mr. Bodiham tore it open. It contained a pamphlet, larger than his own and more elegant in appearance. "The House of Sheeny, Clerical Outfitters, Birmingham." He turned over the pages. The catalogue was tastefully and ecclesiastically printed in antique characters with illuminated Gothic initials. Red marginal lines, crossed at the corners after the manner of an Oxford picture frame, enclosed each page of type. Little red crosses took the place of full stops. Mr. Bodiham turned the pages. Soutane in best black merino, ready to wear, in all sizes. Clerical frock coats from 9 guineas. A dressy garment tailored by our own experienced ecclesiastical cutters. Half-tone illustrations represented young curates, some dapper, some Rugbeian and muscular, some with ascetic faces and large ecstatic eyes, dressed in jackets, in frock coats, in surplices, in clerical evening dress, in black Norfolk suitings. A large assortment of chasubles, rope girdles, Sheeny's special skirt cassocks, tied by a string about the waist, when worn under a surplice, presents an appearance indistinguishable from that of a complete cassock, recommended for summer wear and hot climates. With a gesture of horror and disgust, Mr. Bodiham threw the catalogue into the waste-paper basket. Mrs. Bodiham looked at him. Her pale, glaucous eyes reflected his action without comment. "The village," she said in her quiet voice, "the village grows worse and worse every day." "What has happened now?" asked Mr. Bodiham, feeling suddenly very weary. "I'll tell you." She pulled up a brown varnished chair and sat down. In the village of Crome, it seemed, Sodom and Gomorrah had come to a second birth. End of chapter. Chapter 10. Denis did not dance, but when ragtime came squirting out of the pianola in gushes of treacle and hot perfume, in jets of Bengal light, then things began to dance inside him. Little black nigger corpuscles jigged and drummed in his arteries. He became a cage of movement, a walking palais de danse. It was very uncomfortable, like the preliminary symptoms of a disease. He sat in one of the window seats, glumly pretending to read. At the pianola, Henry Wimbush, smoking a long cigar through a tunnelled pillar of amber, trod out the shattering dance music with serene patience. Locked together, Gombold and Anne moved with a harmoniousness that made them seem a single creature, two-headed and four-legged. Mr. Scogan, solemnly buffoonish, shuffled round the room with Mary. Jenny sat in the shadow behind the piano, scribbling, so it seemed, in a big red notebook. In armchairs by the fireplace, Priscilla and Mr. Barbecue Smith discussed higher things without apparently being disturbed by the noise on the lower plane. "Optimism," said Mr. Barbecue Smith with a tone of finality, speaking through the strains of the Wild Wild Women, "optimism is the opening of the soul towards the light. It is an expansion towards and into God. It is a spiritual self-unification with the infinite." "How true," sighed Priscilla, nodding the baleful splendours of her coiffure. "Pessimism, on the other hand, is the contraction of the soul toward darkness. It is a focusing of the self upon a point in the lower plane. It is a spiritual slavery to mere facts, to gross physical phenomena." "They're making a wild man of me," the refrain sang itself over in Denis's mind. Yes, they were, damn them, a wild man, but not wild enough, that was the trouble. Wild inside, raging, writhing, yes, writhing was the word, writhing with desire. But outwardly he was hopelessly tame. Outwardly, bah, bah, bah. There they were, Anne and Gombold, moving together as though they were a single supple creature. The beast with two backs. And he sat in a corner, pretending to read, pretending he didn't want to dance, pretending he rather despised dancing. Why? It was the bar business again. Why was he born with a different face? Why was he? Gombold had a face of brass, one of those old brazen rams that thumped against the walls of cities till they fell. He was born with a different face, a woolly face. The music stopped. The single harmonious creature broke into two. Flushed, a little breathless, Anne swayed across the room to the pianola, laid her hand on Mr. Wimbush's shoulder. "A waltz this time, please, Uncle Henry," she said. "A waltz," he repeated, and turned to the cabinet where the rolls were kept. He trod off the old roll and trod on the new, a slave at the mill, uncomplainingly and beautifully well bred. Rum-tum, rum-ti-ti, tum-ti-ti. The melody wallowed oozingly along like a ship moving forward over a sleek and oily swell. The four-legged creature, more graceful, more harmonious in its movements than ever, slid across the floor. Oh, why was he born with a different face? "What are you reading?" He looked up, startled. It was Mary. She had broken from the uncomfortable embrace of Mr. Scogan, who had now seized on Jenny for his victim. "What are you reading?" "I don't know," said Denis truthfully. He looked at the title page. The book was called The Stock Breeder's Vade Mecum. "I think you're so sensible to sit and read quietly," said Mary, fixing him with her china eyes. "I don't know why one dances. It's so boring." Denis made no reply. She exacerbated him. From the armchair by the fireplace he heard Priscilla's deep voice. "Tell me, Mr. Barbecue Smith. You know all about science. I know." A deprecating noise came from Mr. Barbecue Smith's chair. "This Einstein theory. It seems to upset the whole starry universe. It makes me so worried about my horoscopes. You see..." Mary renewed her attack. "Which of the contemporary poets do you like best?" she asked. Denis was filled with fury. Why couldn't this pest of a girl leave him alone? He wanted to listen to the horrible music, to watch them dancing, oh, with what grace, as though they had been made for one another, to savour his misery in peace. And she came and put him through this absurd catechism. She was like Mangold's questions. "What are the 3 diseases of wheat? Which of the contemporary poets do you like best?" "Blight, mildew and smut," he replied, with the laconism of one who is absolutely certain of his own mind. It was several hours before Denis managed to go to sleep that night. Vague but agonising miseries possessed his mind. It was not only Anne who made him miserable. He was wretched about himself, the future, life in general, the universe. "This adolescence business," he repeated to himself every now and then, "is horribly boring," but the fact that he knew his disease did not help him to cure it. After kicking all the clothes off his bed, he got up and sought relief in composition. He wanted to imprison his nameless misery in words. At the end of an hour, 9 more or less complete lines emerged from among the blots and scratchings. "I do not know what I desire when summer nights are dark and still, when the wind's many-voiced choir sleeps among the muffled branches. I long and know not what I will, and not a sound of life or laughter stanches time's black and silent flow. I do not know what I desire, I do not know. He read it through aloud, then threw the scribbled sheet into the waste-paper basket and got into bed again. In a very few minutes he was asleep. End of chapter. Chapter 11. Mr. Barbecue Smith was gone. The motor had whirled him away to the station. A faint smell of burning oil commemorated his recent departure. A considerable detachment had come into the courtyard to speed him on his way, and now they were walking back round the side of the house towards the terrace and the garden. They walked in silence. Nobody had yet ventured to comment on the departed guest. "Well," said Anne at last, turning with raised, inquiring eyebrows to Denis. Well, it was time for someone to begin. Denis declined the invitation. He passed it on to Mr. Scogan. "Well," he said. Mr. Scogan did not respond. He only repeated the question. "Well?" It was left for Henry Wimbush to make a pronouncement. "A very agreeable adjunct to the week-end," he said. His tone was obituary. They had descended, without paying much attention to where they were going, the steep yew-walk that went down under the flank of the terrace to the pool. The house towered above them, immensely tall, with the whole height of the built-up terrace added to its own 70 feet of brick façade. The perpendicular lines of the three towers soared up uninterrupted, enhancing the impression of height until it became overwhelming. They paused at the edge of the pool to look back. "The man who built this house knew his business," said Denis. "He was an architect." "Was he?" said Henry Wimbush reflectively. "I doubt it. The builder of this house was Sir Ferdinando Lapith, who flourished during the reign of Elizabeth. He inherited the estate from his father, to whom it had been granted at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. For Crome was originally a cloister of monks, and this swimming pool their fish pond. Sir Ferdinando was not content merely to adapt the old monastic buildings to his own purposes, but using them as a stone quarry for his barns and byres and outhouses, he built for himself a grand new house of brick, the house you see now." He waved his hand in the direction of the house and was silent. Severe, imposing, almost menacing, Crome loomed down on them. "The great thing about Crome," said Mr. Scogan, seizing the opportunity to speak, "is the fact that it's so unmistakably and aggressively a work of art. It makes no compromise with nature, but affronts it and rebels against it. It has no likeness to Shelley's tower in the Epipsychidion, which, if I remember rightly, seems not now a work of human art, but as it were titanic, in the heart of earth having assumed its form and grown out of the mountain from the living stone, lifting itself in caverns light and high. No, there isn't any nonsense of that sort about Crome. That the hovels of the peasantry should look as though they'd grown out of the earth, to which their inmates are attached, is right, no doubt, and suitable. But the house of an intelligent, civilised and sophisticated man should never seem to have sprouted from the clods. It should rather be an expression of his grand, unnatural remoteness from the cloddish life. Since the days of William Morris, that's a fact which we in England have been unable to comprehend. Civilised and sophisticated men have solemnly played at being peasants. Hence quaintness, arts and crafts, cottage architecture, and all the rest of it. In the suburbs of our cities you may see, reduplicated in endless rows, studiedly quaint imitations and adaptations of the village hovel. Poverty, ignorance, and a limited range of materials produce the hovel, which possesses undoubtedly, in suitable surroundings, its own, as it were, titanic charm. We now employ our wealth, our technical knowledge, our rich variety of materials for the purpose of building millions of imitation hovels in totally unsuitable surroundings. Could imbecility go further? Henry Wimbush took up the thread of his interrupted discourse. "All that you say, my dear Scogan," he began, "is certainly very just, very true. But whether Sir Ferdinando shared your views about architecture, or if, indeed, he had any views about architecture at all, I very much doubt. In building this house, Sir Ferdinando was, as a matter of fact, preoccupied by only one thought: the proper placing of his privies. Sanitation was the one great interest of his life. In 1573 he even published on this subject a little book, now extremely scarce, called Certain Privy Councils, by one of Her Majesty's most honourable Privy Councils, F.L. Knight, in which the whole matter is treated with great learning and elegance. His guiding principle in arranging the sanitation of a house was to secure that the greatest possible distance should separate the privy from the sewage arrangements. Hence it followed inevitably that the privies were to be placed at the top of the house, being connected by vertical shafts with pits or channels in the ground. It must not be thought that Sir Ferdinando was moved only by material and merely sanitary considerations. For the placing of his privies in an exalted position he had also certain excellent spiritual reasons. For, he argues in the 3rd chapter of his Privy Councils, the necessities of nature are so base and brutish that in obeying them we are apt to forget that we are the noblest creatures of the universe. To counteract these degrading effects, he advised that the privy should be in every house the room nearest to heaven, that it should be well provided with windows commanding an extensive and noble prospect, and that the walls of the chamber should be lined with bookshelves containing all the ripest products of human wisdom, such as the Proverbs of Solomon, Boethius's Consolations of Philosophy, the Apothegms of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, the Enchiridion of Erasmus, and all other works, ancient or modern, which testify to the nobility of the human soul. In Crome he was able to put his theories into practice. At the top of each of the 3 projecting towers he placed a privy. From these a shaft went down the whole height of the house, that is to say, more than 70 feet, through the cellars, and into a series of conduits provided with flowing water, tunnelled in the ground on a level with the base of the raised terrace. These conduits emptied themselves into the stream several hundred yards below the fish pond. The total depth of the shafts from the top of the towers to their subterranean conduits was 102 feet. The 18th century, with its passion for modernisation, swept away these monuments of sanitary ingenuity. Were it not for tradition and the explicit account of them left by Sir Ferdinando, we should be unaware that these noble privies had ever existed. We should even suppose that Sir Ferdinando built his house after this strange and splendid model for merely aesthetic reasons. The contemplation of the glories of the past always evoked in Henry Wimbush a certain enthusiasm. Under the grey bowler his face worked and glowed as he spoke. The thought of these vanished privies moved him profoundly. He ceased to speak. The light gradually died out of his face, and it became once more the replica of the grave, polite hat which shaded it. There was a long silence. The same gently melancholy thoughts seemed to possess the mind of each of them. Permanence, transience. Sir Ferdinando and his privies were gone. Crome still stood. How brightly the sun shone, and how inevitable was death. The ways of God were strange, the ways of men were stranger still. "It does one's heart good," exclaimed Mr. Scogan at last, "to hear of these fantastic English aristocrats, to have a theory about privies, and to build an immense and splendid house in order to put it into practice. It's magnificent, beautiful. I like to think of them all, the eccentric milords rolling across Europe in ponderous carriages, bound on extraordinary errands. One is going to Venice to buy La Bianchi's larynx. He won't get it till she's dead, of course, but no matter, he's prepared to wait. He has a collection, pickled in glass bottles, of the throats of famous opera singers. And the instruments of renowned virtuosi, he goes in for them too. He will try to bribe Paganini to part with his little Guarnerio, but he has small hope of success. Paganini won't sell his fiddle, but perhaps he might sacrifice one of his guitars. Others are bound on crusades, one to die miserably among the savage Greeks, another in his white top hat to lead Italians against their oppressors. Others have no business at all. They are just giving their oddity a continental airing. At home they cultivate themselves at leisure and with greater elaboration. Beckford builds towers, Portland digs holes in the ground, Cavendish, the millionaire, lives in a stable, eats nothing but mutton, and amuses himself, solely for his private delectation, by anticipating the electrical discoveries of half a century. Glorious eccentrics. Every age is enlivened by their presence. "Some day, my dear Denis," said Mr. Scogan, turning a beady, bright regard in his direction, Some day you must become their biographer. The lives of queer men. What a subject. I should like to undertake it myself." Mr. Scogan paused, looked up once more at the towering house, then murmured the word eccentricity 2 or 3 times. Eccentricity. It's the justification of all aristocracies. It justifies leisured classes and inherited wealth and privilege and endowments and all the other injustices of that sort. If you're to do anything reasonable in this world, you must have a class of people who are secure, safe from public opinion, safe from poverty, leisured, not compelled to waste their time in the imbecile routines that go by the name of honest work. You must have a class of which the members can think and, within the obvious limits, do what they please. You must have a class in which people who have eccentricities can indulge them, and in which eccentricity in general will be tolerated and understood. That's the important thing about an aristocracy. Not only is it eccentric itself, often grandiosely so, it also tolerates and even encourages eccentricity in others. The eccentricities of the artist and the newfangled thinker don't inspire it with that fear, loathing and disgust which the burgesses instinctively feel towards them. It is a sort of Red Indian reservation planted in the midst of a vast horde of poor whites, colonials at that. Within its boundaries wild men disport themselves, often, it must be admitted, a little grossly, a little too flamboyantly, and when kindred spirits are born outside the pale, it offers them some sort of refuge from the hatred which the poor whites, en bon bourgeois, lavish on anything that is wild or out of the ordinary. After the social revolution, there will be no reservations. The redskins will be drowned in the great sea of poor whites. What then? Will they suffer you to go on writing villanelles, my good Denis? Will you, unhappy Henry, be allowed to live in this house of the splendid privies, to continue your quiet delving in the mines of futile knowledge? Will Anne... "And you," said Anne, interrupting him, "will you be allowed to go on talking?" "You may rest assured," Mr. Scogan replied, "that I shall not. I shall have some honest work to do." End of chapter. Chapter 12. Blight, mildew and smut. Mary was puzzled and distressed. Perhaps her ears had played her false. Perhaps what he had really said was Squire Binion and Shanks, or Childs, Blunden and Earp, or even Abercrombie, Drinkwater and Rabindranath Tagore. Perhaps. But then her ears never did play her false. Blight, mildew and smut. The impression was distinct and ineffaceable. Blight, mildew. She was forced to the conclusion, reluctantly, that Denis had indeed pronounced those improbable words. He had deliberately repelled her attempts to open a serious discussion. That was horrible. A man who would not talk seriously to a woman just because she was a woman? Oh, impossible. Egeria or nothing. Perhaps Gombold would be more satisfactory. True, his meridional heredity was a little disquieting, but at least he was a serious worker, and it was with his work that she should associate herself. And Denis, after all, what was Denis? A dilettante, an amateur. Gombold had annexed for his painting room a little disused granary that stood by itself in a green close beyond the farmyard. It was a square brick building with a peaked roof and little windows set high up in each of its walls. A ladder of 4 rungs led up to the door, for the granary was perched above the ground and out of the reach of the rats on 4 massive toadstools of grey stone. Within there lingered a faint smell of dust and cobwebs, and the narrow shaft of sunlight that came slanting in at every hour of the day through one of the little windows was always alive with silvery motes. Here Gombold worked, with a kind of concentrated ferocity, during 6 or 7 hours of each day. He was pursuing something new, something terrific, if only he could catch it. During the last 8 years, nearly half of which had been spent in the process of winning the war, he had worked his way industriously through Cubism. Now he had come out on the other side. He had begun by painting a formalised nature. Then, little by little, he had risen from nature into the world of pure form, till, in the end, he was painting nothing but his own thoughts, externalised in the abstract geometrical forms of the mind's devising. He found the process arduous and exhilarating. And then, quite suddenly, he grew dissatisfied. He felt himself cramped and confined within intolerably narrow limitations. He was humiliated to find how few and crude and uninteresting were the forms he could invent. The inventions of nature were without number, inconceivably subtle and elaborate. He had done with Cubism. He was out on the other side. But the Cubist discipline preserved him from falling into excesses of nature worship. He took from nature its rich, subtle, elaborate forms, but his aim was always to work them into a whole that should have the thrilling simplicity and formality of an idea, to combine prodigious realism with prodigious simplification. Memories of Caravaggio's portentous achievements haunted him. Forms of breathing, living reality emerged from darkness, built themselves up into compositions as luminously simple and single as a mathematical idea. He thought of the Call of Matthew, of Peter crucified, of the lute players, of Magdalene. He had the secret, that astonishing ruffian. He had the secret. And now Gombauld was after it, in hot pursuit. Yes, it would be something terrific if only he could catch it. For a long time an idea had been stirring and spreading yeastily in his mind. He had made a portfolio full of studies, he had drawn a cartoon, and now the idea was taking shape on canvas. A man fallen from a horse. The huge animal, a gaunt white cart-horse, filled the upper half of the picture with its great body. Its head, lowered towards the ground, was in shadow. The immense bony body was what arrested the eye, the body and the legs which came down on either side of the picture like the pillars of an arch. On the ground, between the legs of the towering beast, lay the foreshortened figure of a man, the head in the extreme foreground, the arms flung wide to right and left. A white, relentless light poured down from a point in the right foreground. The beast, the fallen man, were sharply illuminated. Round them, beyond and behind them, was the night. They were alone in the darkness, a universe in themselves. The horse's body filled the upper part of the picture. The legs, the great hoofs, frozen to stillness in the midst of their trampling, limited it on either side. And beneath lay the man, his foreshortened face at the focal point in the centre, his arms outstretched towards the sides of the picture. Under the arch of the horse's belly, between his legs, the eye looked through into an intense darkness. Below, the space was closed in by the figure of the prostrate man, a central gulf of darkness surrounded by luminous forms. The picture was more than half finished. Gombauld had been at work all morning on the figure of the man, and now he was taking a rest, the time to smoke a cigarette. Tilting back his chair till it touched the wall, he looked thoughtfully at his canvas. He was pleased, and at the same time he was desolated. In itself the thing was good, he knew it. But that something he was after, that something that would be so terrific if only he could catch it. Had he caught it? Would he ever catch it? 3 little taps, rat-tat-tat. Surprised, Gombauld turned his eyes towards the door. Nobody ever disturbed him while he was at work. It was one of the unwritten laws. "Come in," he called. The door, which was ajar, swung open, revealing, from the waist upwards, the form of Mary. She had only dared to mount halfway up the ladder. If he didn't want her, retreat would be easier and more dignified than if she climbed to the top. "May I come in?" she asked. "Certainly." She skipped up the remaining 2 rungs and was over the threshold in an instant. "A letter came for you by second post," she said. "I thought it might be important, so I brought it out to you." Her eyes, her childish face, were luminously candid as she handed him the letter. There had never been a flimsier pretext. Gombauld looked at the envelope and put it in his pocket unopened. "Luckily," he said, "it isn't at all important. Thanks very much, all the same." There was a silence. Mary felt a little uncomfortable. "May I have a look at what you're painting?" she had the courage to say at last. Gombauld had only half smoked his cigarette. In any case, he wouldn't begin work again until he had finished. He would give her the 5 minutes that separated him from the bitter end. "This is the best place to see it from," he said. Mary looked at the picture for some time without saying anything. Indeed, she didn't know what to say. She was taken aback. She was at a loss. She had expected a Cubist masterpiece, and here was a picture of a man and a horse, not only recognisable as such, but even aggressively enjoying. Trompe-l'oeil, there was no other word to describe the delineation of that foreshortened figure under the trampling feet of the horse. What was she to think? What was she to say? Her orientations were gone. One could admire representationism in the old masters, obviously, but in a modern... At 18 she might have done so, but now, after 5 years of schooling among the best judges, her instinctive reaction to a contemporary piece of representation was contempt, an outburst of laughing disparagement. What could Gombauld be up to? She had felt so safe in admiring his work before, but now she didn't know what to think. It was very difficult. Very difficult. "There's rather a lot of chiaroscuro, isn't there?" she ventured at last, and inwardly congratulated herself on having found a critical formula so gentle and at the same time so penetrating. "There is," Gombauld agreed. Mary was pleased. He accepted her criticism. It was a serious discussion. She put her head on one side and screwed up her eyes. "I think it's awfully fine," she said, "but of course it's a little too trompe-l'oeil for my taste." She looked at Gombauld, who made no response but continued to smoke, gazing meditatively all the time at his picture. Mary went on gaspingly. "When I was in Paris this spring, I saw a lot of Czuplinski. I admire his work so tremendously. Of course, it's frightfully abstract now, frightfully abstract and frightfully intellectual. He just throws a few oblongs onto his canvas, quite flat, you know, and painted in pure primary colours. But his design is wonderful. He's getting more and more abstract every day. He'd given up the third dimension when I was there and was just thinking of giving up the second. Soon, he says, there'll be just a blank canvas. That's the logical conclusion, complete abstraction. Painting's finished. He's finishing it. When he's reached pure abstraction, he's going to take up architecture. He says it's more intellectual than painting. Do you agree?" she asked, with a final gasp. Gombauld dropped his cigarette end and trod on it. "Czuplinski's finished painting," he said. "I've finished my cigarette, but I'm going on painting." And, advancing towards her, he put his arm round her shoulders and turned her round away from the picture. Mary looked at him, her hair swung back a soundless bell of gold. Her eyes were serene. She smiled. So the moment had come. His arm was round her. He moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, and she moved with him. It was a peripatetic embrace. "Do you agree with him?" she repeated. The moment might have come, but she would not cease to be intellectual, serious. "I don't know. I shall have to think about it." Gombauld loosened his embrace. His hand dropped from her shoulder. "Be careful going down the ladder," he added solicitously. Mary looked round, startled. They were in front of the open door. She remained standing there for a moment in bewilderment. The hand that had rested on her shoulders made itself felt lower down her back. It administered 3 or 4 kindly little smacks. Replying automatically to its stimulus, she moved forward. "Be careful going down the ladder," said Gombauld once more. She was careful. The door closed behind her, and she was alone in the little green close. She walked slowly back through the farmyard. She was pensive. End of chapter. Chapter 13. Henry Wimbush brought down with him to dinner a budget of printed sheets loosely bound together in a cardboard portfolio. "Today," he said, exhibiting it with a certain solemnity, "today I have finished the printing of my History of Crome. I helped to set up the type of the last page this evening." "The famous history!" cried Anne. The writing and printing of this magnum opus had been going on as long as she could remember. All her childhood long, Uncle Henry's history had been a vague and fabulous thing, often heard of and never seen. "It has taken me nearly 30 years," said Mr. Wimbush. 25 years of writing and nearly 4 of printing. And now it's finished. The whole chronicle, from Sir Ferdinando Lapith's birth to the death of my father William Wimbush, more than 3 centuries and a half. A history of Crome, written at Crome and printed at Crome by my own press. "Shall we be allowed to read it now it's finished?" asked Denis. Mr. Wimbush nodded. "Certainly," he said. "And I hope you will not find it uninteresting," he added modestly. Our muniment room is particularly rich in ancient records, and I have some genuinely new light to throw on the introduction of the three-pronged fork." "And the people?" asked Gombold, "Sir Ferdinando and the rest of them. Were they amusing? Were there any crimes or tragedies in the family?" "Let me see." Henry Wimbush rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I can only think of 2 suicides, 1 violent death, 4 or perhaps 5 broken hearts, and half a dozen little blots on the scutcheon in the way of misalliances, seductions, natural children, and the like. No, on the whole, it's a placid and uneventful record." "The Wimbushes and the Lapiths were always an unadventurous, respectable crew," said Priscilla, with a note of scorn in her voice. "If I were to write my family history now, why, it would be one long continuous blot from beginning to end." She laughed jovially and helped herself to another glass of wine. "If I were to write mine," Mr. Scogan remarked, "it wouldn't exist. After the second generations, we Scogans are lost in the mists of antiquity." "After dinner," said Henry Wimbush, a little piqued by his wife's disparaging comment on the masters of Crome, "I'll read you an episode from my history that will make you admit that even the Lapiths, in their own respectable way, had their tragedies and strange adventures." "I'm glad to hear it," said Priscilla. "Glad to hear what?" asked Jenny, emerging suddenly from her private interior world like a cuckoo from a clock. She received an explanation, smiled, nodded, cuckooed at last, "I see," and popped back, clapping shut the door behind her. Dinner was eaten. The party had adjourned to the drawing-room. "Now," said Henry Wimbush, pulling up a chair to the lamp. He put on his round pince-nez, rimmed with tortoiseshell, and began cautiously to turn over the pages of his loose and still fragmentary book. He found his place at last. "Shall I begin?" he asked, looking up. "Do," said Priscilla, yawning. In the midst of an attentive silence, Mr. Wimbush gave a little preliminary cough and started to read. "The infant who was destined to become the 4th baronet of the name of Lapith was born in the year 1740. He was a very small baby, weighing not more than 3 pounds at birth, but from the first he was sturdy and healthy. In honour of his maternal grandfather, Sir Hercules Ockham of Bishop's Ockham, he was christened Hercules. His mother, like many other mothers, kept a notebook in which his progress from month to month was recorded. He walked at 10 months, and before his 2nd year was out he had learned to speak a number of words. At 3 years he weighed but 24 pounds, and at 6, though he could read and write perfectly and showed a remarkable aptitude for music, he was no larger and heavier than a well-grown child of 2. Meanwhile, his mother had borne 2 other children, a boy and a girl, one of whom died of croup during infancy, while the other was carried off by smallpox before it reached the age of 5. Hercules remained the only surviving child. On his 12th birthday, Hercules was still only 3 feet and 2 inches in height. His head, which was very handsome and nobly shaped, was too big for his body, but otherwise he was exquisitely proportioned and, for his size, of great strength and agility. His parents, in the hope of making him grow, consulted all the most eminent physicians of the time. Their various prescriptions were followed to the letter, but in vain. One ordered a very plentiful meat diet, another exercise, a third constructed a little rack modelled on those employed by the Holy Inquisition, to which Hercules was stretched with excruciating torments for half an hour every morning and evening. In the course of the next 3 years Hercules gained perhaps 2 inches. After that his growth stopped completely, and he remained for the rest of his life a pygmy of 3 feet and 4 inches. His father, who had built the most extravagant hopes upon his son, planning for him in his imagination a military career equal to that of Marlborough, found himself a disappointed man. "I have brought an abortion into the world," he would say, and he took so violent a dislike to his son that the boy dared scarcely come into his presence. His temper, which had been serene, was turned by disappointment to moroseness and savagery. He avoided all company, being, as he said, ashamed to show himself the father of a lusus naturae amongst normal, healthy human beings, and took to solitary drinking, which carried him very rapidly to his grave. For, the year before Hercules came of age, his father was taken off by an apoplexy. His mother, whose love for him had increased with the growth of his father's unkindness, did not long survive, but little more than a year after her husband's death, succumbed, after eating 24 of oysters, to an attack of typhoid fever. Hercules thus found himself at the age of 21 alone in the world, and master of a considerable fortune, including the estate and mansion of Crome. The beauty and intelligence of his childhood had survived into his manly age, and but for his dwarfish stature he would have taken his place among the handsomest and most accomplished young men of his time. He was well read in the Greek and Latin authors, as well as in all the moderns of any merit who had written in English, French, or Italian. He had a good ear for music, and was no indifferent performer on the violin, which he used to play like a bass viol, seated on a chair with the instrument between his legs. To the music of the harpsichord and clavichord he was extremely partial, but the smallness of his hands made it impossible for him ever to perform upon these instruments. He had a small ivory flute made for him, on which, whenever he was melancholy, he used to play a simple country air or jig, affirming that this rustic music had more power to clear and raise the spirits than the most artificial productions of the masters. From an early age he practised the composition of poetry, but, though conscious of his great powers in this art, he would never publish any specimen of his writing. "My stature," he would say, "is reflected in my verses. If the public were to read them, it would not be because I am a poet, but because I am a dwarf." Several manuscript books of Sir Hercules' poems survive. A single specimen will suffice to illustrate his qualities as a poet. In ancient days, while yet the world was young, ere Abraham fed his flocks or Homer sung, when blacksmith Tubal tamed creative fire, and Jabal dwelt in tents, and Jubal struck the lyre, flesh grown corrupt brought forth a monstrous birth, and obscene giants trod the shrinking earth, till God, impatient of their sinful brood, gave rein to wrath and drowned them in the flood. Teeming again, repeopled Tellus bore the lubber hero and the man of war, huge towers of brawn, topped with an empty skull, witlessly bold, heroically dull. Long ages passed, and man grown more refined, slighter in muscle but of vaster mind, smiled at his grandsire's broadsword, bow and bill, and learned to wield the pencil and the quill. The glowing canvas and the written page immortalized his name from age to age, his name emblazoned on fame's temple wall, for art grew great as humankind grew small. Thus man's long progress step by step we trace. The giant dies, the hero takes his place. The giant vile, the dull heroic block, at one we shudder and at one we mock. Man last appears. In him the soul's pure flame burns brightlier in a not inordinate frame. Of old, when heroes fought and giants swarmed, men were huge mounds of matter scarce informed. Wearied by leavening so vast a mass, the spirit slept, and all the mind was crass. The smaller carcass of these latter days is soon informed. The soul unwearied plays, and like a Pharaoh's darts abroad her mental rays. But can we think that Providence will stay man's footsteps here upon the upward way? Mankind in understanding and in grace advanced so far beyond the giant's race? Hence, impious thought, still, led by God's own hand, mankind proceeds towards the promised land. A time will come, prophetic, I descry remoter dawns along the gloomy sky, when happy mortals of a golden age will backwards turn the dark historic page, and, in our vaunted race of men, behold a form as gross, a mind as dead and cold as we in giants see, in warriors of old. A time will come when in the soul shall be from all superfluous matter wholly free, when the light body, agile as a fawn's, shall sport with grace along the velvet lawns. Nature's most delicate and final birth, mankind, perfected, shall possess the earth. But not yet, for still the giant's race, huge, though diminished, tramps the earth's fair face, gross and repulsive, yet perversely proud. Men of their imperfections boast aloud, vain of their bulk, of all they still retain, of giant ugliness, absurdly vain. At all that's small they point their stupid scorn, and, monsters, think themselves divinely born. Sad is the fate of those, sad indeed, the rare precursors of the nobler breed, who come man's golden glory to foretell, but pointing heavenwards, live themselves in hell. As soon as he came into the estate, Sir Hercules set about remodelling his household, for, though by no means ashamed of his deformity, indeed, if we may judge from the poem quoted above, he regarded himself as being in many ways superior to the ordinary race of man, he found the presence of full-grown men and women embarrassing. Realizing, too, that he must abandon all ambitions in the great world, he determined to retire absolutely from it, and to create, as it were, at Crome, a private world of his own, in which all should be proportionable to himself. Accordingly, he discharged all the old servants of the house and replaced them gradually, as he was able to find suitable successors, by others of dwarfish stature. In the course of a few years he had assembled about himself a numerous household, no member of which was above 4 feet high, and the smallest among them scarcely 2 feet and 6 inches. His father's dogs, such as setters, mastiffs, greyhounds, and a pack of beagles, he sold or gave away as too large and too boisterous for his house, replacing them by pugs and King Charles spaniels and whatever other breeds of dog were the smallest. His father's stable was also sold. For his own use, whether riding or driving, he had 6 black Shetland ponies, with 4 very choice piebald animals of New Forest breed. Having thus settled his household entirely to his own satisfaction, it only remained for him to find some suitable companion with whom to share his paradise. Sir Hercules had a susceptible heart, and had more than once, between the ages of 16 and 20, felt what it was to love. But here his deformity had been a source of the most bitter humiliation, for, having once dared to declare himself to a young lady of his choice, he had been received with laughter. On his persisting, she had picked him up and shaken him like an importunate child, telling him to run away and plague her no more. The story soon got about. Indeed, the young lady herself used to tell it as a particularly pleasant anecdote, and the taunts and mockery it occasioned were a source of the most acute distress to Hercules. From the poems written at this period, we gather that he meditated taking his own life. In course of time, however, he lived down this humiliation, but never again, though he often fell in love, and that very passionately, did he dare to make any advances to those in whom he was interested. After coming to the estate and finding that he was in a position to create his own world as he desired it, he saw that if he was to have a wife, which he very much desired, being of an affectionate and indeed amorous temper, he must choose her as he had chosen his servants, from among the race of dwarfs. But to find a suitable wife was, he found, a matter of some difficulty, for he would marry none who was not distinguished by beauty and gentle birth. The dwarfish daughter of Lord Bemborough he refused on the ground that besides being a pygmy, she was hunchbacked, while another young lady, an orphan belonging to a very good family in Hampshire, was rejected by him because her face, like that of so many dwarfs, was wizened and repulsive. Finally, when he was almost despairing of success, he heard from a reliable source that Count Titimalo, a Venetian nobleman, possessed a daughter of exquisite beauty and great accomplishments, who was by 3 feet in height. Setting out at once for Venice, he went immediately on his arrival to pay his respects to the Count, whom he found living with his wife and 5 children in a very mean apartment in one of the poorer quarters of town. Indeed, the Count was so far reduced in his circumstances that he was even negotiating, so it was rumoured, with a travelling company of clowns and acrobats who had had the misfortune to lose their performing dwarf for the sale of his diminutive daughter Philomena. Sir Hercules arrived in time to save her from this untoward fate, for he was so much charmed by Philomena's grace and beauty that at the end of 3 days' courtship he made her a formal offer of marriage, which was accepted by her no less joyfully than by her father, who perceived in an English son-in-law a rich and unfailing source of revenue. After an unostentatious marriage, at which the English ambassador acted as one of the witnesses, Sir Hercules and his bride returned by sea to England, where they settled down, as it proved, to a life of uneventful happiness. Crome and its household of dwarfs delighted Philomena, who felt herself now, for the first time, to be a free woman living among her equals in a friendly world. She had many tastes in common with her husband, especially that of music. She had a beautiful voice of a power surprising in one so small, and could touch A in alt without effort. Accompanied by her husband on his fine Cremona fiddle, which he played, as we have noted before, as one plays the bass viol, she would sing all the liveliest and tenderest airs from the operas and cantatas of her native country. Seated together at the harpsichord, they found that they could, with their 4 hands, play all the music written for 2 hands of ordinary size, a circumstance which gave Sir Hercules unfailing pleasure. When they were not making music or reading together, which they often did, both in English and Italian, they spent their time in healthful outdoor exercises, sometimes rowing in a little boat on the lake, but more often riding or driving, occupations in which, because they were entirely new to her, Philomena especially delighted. When she had become a perfectly proficient rider, Philomena and her husband used often to go hunting in the park, at that time very much more extensive than it is now. They hunted not foxes nor hares, but rabbits, using a pack of about 30 black and fawn-coloured pugs, a kind of dog which, when not overfed, can course a rabbit as well as any of the smaller breeds. 4 dwarf grooms, dressed in scarlet liveries and mounted on white Exmoor ponies, hunted the pack, while their master and mistress, in green habits, followed either on the black Shetlands or on the piebald New Forest ponies. A picture of the whole hunt, dogs, horses, grooms and masters, was painted by William Stubbs, whose work Sir Hercules admired so much that he invited him, though a man of ordinary stature, to come and stay at the mansion for the purpose of executing this picture. Stubbs likewise painted a portrait of Sir Hercules and his lady driving in their green enamelled calash, drawn by 4 black Shetlands. Sir Hercules wears a plum-coloured velvet coat and white breeches. Philomena is dressed in flowered muslin and a very large hat with pink feathers. The 2 figures in their gay carriage stand out sharply against a dark background of trees. But to the left of the picture the trees fall away and disappear, so that the 4 black ponies are seen against a pale and strangely lurid sky that has the golden-brown colour of thunderclouds lighted up by the sun. In this way 4 years passed happily by. At the end of that time Philomena found herself great with child. Sir Hercules was overjoyed. "If God is good," he wrote in his daybook, "the name of Lapith will be preserved, and our rarer and more delicate race transmitted through the generations, until, in the fullness of time, the world shall recognise the superiority of those beings whom now it uses to make mock of." On his wife's being brought to bed of a son, he wrote a poem to the same effect. The child was christened Ferdinando in memory of the builder of the house. With the passage of the months, a certain sense of disquiet began to invade the minds of Sir Hercules and his lady, for the child was growing with an extraordinary rapidity. At a year he weighed as much as Hercules had weighed when he was 3. "Ferdinando grows crescendo," wrote Philomena in her diary. "It seems not natural." At 18 months the baby was almost as tall as their smallest jockey, who was a man of 36. Could it be that Ferdinando was destined to become a man of the normal, gigantic dimensions? It was a thought to which neither of his parents dared yet give open utterance, but in the secrecy of their respective diaries they brooded over it in terror and dismay. On his 3rd birthday Ferdinando was taller than his mother, and not more than a couple of inches short of his father's height. "Today, for the first time," wrote Sir Hercules, "we discussed the situation. The hideous truth can be concealed no longer. Ferdinando is not one of us. On this, his 3rd birthday, a day when we should have been rejoicing at the health, the strength and beauty of our child, we wept together over the ruin of our happiness. God give us strength to bear this cross." At the age of 8, Ferdinando was so large and so exuberantly healthy that his parents decided, though reluctantly, to send him to school. He was packed off to Eton at the beginning of the next half. A profound peace settled upon the house. Ferdinando returned for the summer holidays, larger and stronger than ever. One day he knocked down the butler and broke his arm. "He is rough, inconsiderate, unamenable to persuasion," wrote his father. "The only thing that will teach him manners is corporal chastisement." Ferdinando, who at this age was already 17 inches taller than his father, received no corporal chastisement. One summer holidays, about 3 years later, Ferdinando returned to Crome accompanied by a very large mastiff dog. He had bought it from an old man at Windsor who had found the beast too expensive to feed. It was a savage, unreliable animal. Hardly had it entered the house when it attacked one of Sir Hercules' favourite pugs, seizing the creature in its jaws and shaking it till it was nearly dead. Extremely put out by this occurrence, Sir Hercules ordered that the beast should be chained up in the stable yard. Ferdinando sullenly answered that the dog was his, and he would keep it where he pleased. His father, growing angry, bade him take the animal out of the house at once, on pain of his utmost displeasure. Ferdinando refused to move. His mother at this moment coming into the room, the dog flew at her, knocked her down, and in a twinkling had very severely mauled her arm and shoulder. In another instant it must infallibly have had her by the throat, had not Sir Hercules drawn his sword and stabbed the animal to the heart. Turning on his son, he ordered him to leave the room immediately, as being unfit to remain in the same place with the mother whom he had nearly murdered. So awe-inspiring was the spectacle of Sir Hercules standing with one foot on the carcass of the giant dog, his sword drawn and still bloody, so commanding were his voice, his gestures, and the expression of his face, that Ferdinando slunk out of the room in terror, and behaved himself for all the rest of the vacation in an entirely exemplary fashion. His mother soon recovered from the bites of the mastiff, but the effect on her mind of this adventure was ineradicable. From that time forth she lived always among imaginary terrors. The 2 years which Ferdinando spent on the Continent, making the grand tour, were a period of happy repose for his parents. But even now the thought of the future haunted them, nor were they able to solace themselves with all the diversions of their younger days. The Lady Philomena had lost her voice, and Sir Hercules was grown too rheumatical to play the violin. He, it is true, still rode after his pugs, but his wife felt herself too old and, since the episode of the mastiff, too nervous for such sports. At most, to please her husband, she would follow the hunt at a distance in a little gig drawn by the safest and oldest of the Shetlands. The day fixed for Ferdinando's return came round. Philomena, sick with vague dreads and presentiments, retired to her chamber and her bed. Sir Hercules received his son alone. A giant in a brown travelling suit entered the room. "Welcome home, my son," said Sir Hercules in a voice that trembled a little. "I hope I see you well, sir." Ferdinando bent down to shake hands, then straightened himself up again. The top of his father's head reached to the level of his hip. Ferdinando had not come alone. 2 friends of his own age accompanied him, and each of the young men had brought a servant. Not for 30 years had Crome been desecrated by the presence of so many members of the common race of men. Sir Hercules was appalled and indignant, but the laws of hospitality had to be obeyed. He received the young gentlemen with grave politeness and sent the servants to the kitchen, with orders that they should be well cared for. The old family dining table was dragged out into the light and dusted. Sir Hercules and his lady were accustomed to dine at a small table 20 inches high. Simon, the aged butler, who could only just look over the edge of the big table, was helped at supper by the 3 servants brought by Ferdinando and his guests. Sir Hercules presided and, with his usual grace, supported a conversation on the pleasures of foreign travel, the beauties of art and nature to be met with abroad, the opera at Venice, the singing of the orphans in the churches of the same city, and on other topics of similar nature. The young men were not particularly attentive to his discourses. They were occupied in watching the efforts of the butler to change the plates and replenish the glasses. They covered their laughter by violent and repeated fits of coughing or choking. Sir Hercules affected not to notice, but changed the subject of the conversation to sport. Upon this, one of the young men asked whether it was true, as he had heard, that he used to hunt the rabbit with a pack of pug dogs. Sir Hercules replied that it was, and proceeded to describe the chase in some detail. The young men roared with laughter. When supper was over, Sir Hercules climbed down from his chair and, giving as his excuse that he must see how his lady did, bade them good night. The sound of laughter followed him up the stairs. Philomena was not asleep. She had been lying on her bed, listening to the sound of enormous laughter and the tread of strangely heavy feet on the stairs and along the corridors. Sir Hercules drew a chair to her bedside and sat there for a long time in silence, holding his wife's hand and sometimes gently squeezing it. At about 10 o'clock they were startled by a violent noise. There was a breaking of glass, a stamping of feet, with an outburst of shouts and laughter. The uproar continuing for several minutes, Sir Hercules rose to his feet and, in spite of his wife's entreaties, prepared to go and see what was happening. There was no light on the staircase, and Sir Hercules groped his way down cautiously, lowering himself from stair to stair and standing for a moment on each tread before adventuring on a new step. The noise was louder here. The shouting articulated itself into recognisable words and phrases. A line of light was visible under the dining-room door. Sir Hercules tiptoed across the hall towards it. Just as he approached the door, there was another terrific crash of breaking glass and jangled metal. What could they be doing? Standing on tiptoe, he managed to look through the keyhole. In the middle of the ravaged table, old Simon, the butler, so primed with drink that he could scarcely keep his balance, was dancing a jig. His feet crunched and tinkled among the broken glass, and his shoes were wet with spilt wine. The three young men sat round, thumping the table with their hands or with the empty wine bottles, shouting and laughing encouragement. The three servants, leaning against the wall, laughed too. Ferdinando suddenly threw a handful of walnuts at the dancer's head, which so dazed and surprised the little man that he staggered and fell down on his back, upsetting a decanter and several glasses. They raised him up, gave him some brandy to drink, thumped him on the back. The old man smiled and hiccuped. "Tomorrow," said Ferdinando, "we'll have a concerted ballet of the whole household, with Father Hercules wearing his club and lion-skin," added one of his companions, and all three roared with laughter. Sir Hercules would look and listen no further. He crossed the hall once more and began to climb the stairs, lifting his knees painfully high at each degree. This was the end. There was no place for him now in the world, no place for him and Ferdinando together. His wife was still awake. To her questioning glance he answered, "They are making a mock of old Simon. Tomorrow it will be our turn." They were silent for a time. At last Philomena said, "I do not want to see tomorrow." "It is better not," said Sir Hercules. Going into his closet, he wrote in his day-book a full and particular account of all the events of the evening. While he was still engaged in this task, he rang for a servant and ordered hot water and a bath to be made ready for him at 11 o'clock. When he had finished writing, he went into his wife's room and, preparing a dose of opium 20 times as strong as that which she was accustomed to take when she could not sleep, he brought it into her, saying, "Here is your sleeping draught." Philomena took the glass and lay for a little time, but did not drink immediately. The tears came into her eyes. "Do you remember the songs we used to sing, sitting out there sulla terrazza in the summer-time?" She began singing softly in her ghost of a cracked voice a few bars from Stradella's "Amor, amor, non dormir più." "And you playing the violin. It seems such a short time ago, and yet so long, long, long. Addio, amore, arrivederci." She drank off the draught and, lying back on the pillow, closed her eyes. Sir Hercules kissed her hand and tiptoed away, as though he were afraid of waking her. He returned to his closet, and, having recorded his wife's last words to him, he poured into his bath the water that had been brought up in accordance with his orders. The water being too hot for him to get into the bath at once, he took down from the shelf his copy of Suetonius. He wished to read how Seneca had died. He opened the book at random. But dwarfs, he read, he held in abhorrence as being lusus naturae and of ill omen. He winced as though he had been struck. This same Augustus, he remembered, had exhibited in the amphitheatre a young man called Lucius, of good family, who was not quite 2 feet in height and weighed 17 pounds, but had a stentorian voice. He turned over the pages. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. It was a tale of growing horror. Seneca, his preceptor, he forced to kill himself. And there was Praetorius, who had called his friends about him at the last, bidding them to talk to him, not of the consolations of philosophy, but of love and gallantry, while the life was ebbing away through his open veins. Dipping his pen once more in the ink, he wrote on the last page of his diary, "He died a Roman death." Then, putting the toes of one foot into the water, and finding that it was not too hot, he threw off his dressing-gown and, taking a razor in his hand, sat down in the bath. With one deep cut, he severed the artery in his left wrist, then lay back and composed his mind to meditation. The blood oozed out, floating through the water in dissolving wreaths and spirals. In a little while the whole bath was tinged with pink. The colour deepened. Sir Hercules felt himself mastered by an invincible drowsiness. He was sinking from vague dream to dream. Soon he was sound asleep. There was not much blood in his small body. End of chapter. Chapter 14. For their after-luncheon coffee, the party generally adjourned to the library. Its windows looked east, and at this hour of the day it was the coolest place in the whole house. It was a large room, fitted during the 18th century, with white painted shelves of an elegant design. In the middle of one wall, a door, ingeniously upholstered with rows of dummy books, gave access to a deep cupboard, where, among a pile of letter files and old newspapers, the mummy case of an Egyptian lady, brought back by the second Sir Ferdinando on his return from the Grand Tour, mouldered in the darkness. From 10 yards away, and at first glance, one might almost have mistaken this secret door for a section of shelving filled with genuine books. Coffee cup in hand, Mr. Scogan was standing in front of the dummy bookshelf. Between the sips he discoursed. "The bottom shelf," he was saying, "is taken up by an encyclopaedia in 14 volumes. Useful but a little dull, as is also Caprimulge's Dictionary of the Finnish Language. The biographical dictionary looks more promising. Biography of men who were born great, biography of men who achieved greatness, biography of men who had greatness thrust upon them, and biography of men who were never great at all. Then there are 10 volumes of Tom's Works and Wanderings, while The Wild Goose Chase, a novel by an anonymous author, fills no less than 6. But what's this? What's this?" Mr. Scogan stood on tiptoe and peered up. 7 volumes of the Tales of Knockespotch. "The Tales of Knockespotch," he repeated. "Ah, my dear Henry," he said, turning round, "these are your best books. I would willingly give all the rest of your library for them." The happy possessor of a multitude of first editions, Mr. Wimbush, could afford to smile indulgently. "Is it possible," Mr. Scogan went on, "that they possess nothing more than a back and a title?" He opened the cupboard door and peeped inside, as though he hoped to find the rest of the books behind it. "Phew!" he said, and shut the door again. "It smells of dust and mildew. How symbolical! One comes to the great masterpieces of the past, expecting some miraculous illumination, and one finds, on opening them, only darkness and dust and a faint smell of decay. After all, what is reading but a vice, like drink or venery or any other form of excessive self-indulgence? One reads to tickle and amuse one's mind. One reads, above all, to prevent oneself thinking. Still, the Tales of Knockespotch..." He paused and thoughtfully drummed with his fingers on the backs of the non-existent, unattainable books. "But I disagree with you about reading," said Mary. "About serious reading, I mean." "Quite right, Mary, quite right," Mr. Scogan answered. "I had forgotten there were any serious people in the room." "I like the idea of biographies," said Denis. "There's room for us all within the scheme. It's comprehensive." "Yes, the biographies are good, the biographies are excellent," Mr. Scogan agreed. "I imagine them written in a very elegant Regency style. Brighton Pavilion in words, perhaps by the greatest de Lempriere himself. You know his classical dictionary?" "Ah!" Mr. Scogan raised his hand and let it limply fall again in a gesture which implied that words failed him. "Read his biography of Helen. Read how Jupiter, disguised as a swan, was enabled to avail himself of the situation, vis-à-vis to Leda. And to think that he must have written these biographies of the great. What a work, Henry! And owing to the idiotic arrangement of your library, it can't be read." "I prefer The Wild Goose Chase," said Anne. "A novel in 6 volumes. It must be restful." "Restful," Mr. Scogan repeated. "You've hit on the right word. A Wild Goose Chase is sound, but a bit old-fashioned. Pictures of clerical life in the 50s, you know, specimens of the landed gentry, peasants for pathos and comedy. And in the background, always the picturesque beauties of nature, soberly described. All very good and solid, but, like certain puddings, just a little dull. Personally, I like much better the notion of Tom's Works and Wanderings. The eccentric Mr. Tom of Tom's Hill. Old Tom, as his intimates used to call him. He spent 10 years in Tibet organising the clarified butter industry on modern European lines, and was able to retire at 36 with a handsome fortune. The rest of his life he devoted to travel and ratiocination. Here is the result." Mr. Scogan tapped the dummy books. "And now we come to the Tales of Knockespotch. What a masterpiece, and what a great man! Knockespotch knew how to write fiction. Ah, Denis, if you could only read Knockespotch, you wouldn't be writing a novel about the wearisome development of a young man's character. You wouldn't be describing in endless fastidious detail cultured life in Chelsea and Bloomsbury and Hampstead. You would be trying to write a readable book. But then, alas, owing to the peculiar arrangement of our host's library, you will never read Knockespotch." "Nobody could regret the fact more than I do," said Denis. "It was Knockespotch," Mr. Scogan continued, "the great Knockespotch, who delivered us from the dreary tyranny of the realistic novel. My life," Knockespotch said, "is not so long that I can afford to spend precious hours writing or reading descriptions of middle-class interiors." He said again, "I am tired of seeing the human mind bogged in a social plenum. I prefer to paint it in a vacuum, freely and sportively bombinating." "I say," said Gombauld, "Knockespotch was a little obscure sometimes, wasn't he?" "He was," Mr. Scogan replied, "and with intention. It made him seem even profounder than he actually was. But it was only in his aphorisms that he was so dark and oracular. In his tales he was always luminous. Oh, those tales, those tales! How shall I describe them? Fabulous characters shoot across his pages like gaily dressed performers on the trapeze. There are extraordinary adventures and still more extraordinary speculations. Intelligences and emotions, relieved of all the imbecile preoccupations of civilized life, move in intricate and subtle dances, crossing and recrossing, advancing, retreating, impinging. An immense erudition and an immense fancy go hand in hand. All the ideas of the present and of the past, on every possible subject, bob up among the tales, smile gravely or grimace at a caricature of themselves, then disappear to make place for something new. The verbal surface of his writing is rich and fantastically diversified. The wit is incessant. But couldn't you give us a specimen?" Denis broke in. "A concrete example?" "Alas," Mr. Scogan replied, "Knockespotch's great book is like the sword Excalibur. It remains stuck fast in this door, awaiting the coming of a writer with genius enough to draw it forth. I am not even a writer. I am not so much as qualified to attempt the task. The extraction of Knockespotch from this wooden prison I leave, my dear Denis, to you." "Thank you," said Denis. End of chapter. Chapter 15. In the time of the amiable Brantome, Mr. Scogan was saying, every debutante at the French court was invited to dine at the king's table, where she was served with wine in a handsome silver cup of Italian workmanship. It was no ordinary cup, this goblet of the debutantes, for inside it had been most curiously and ingeniously engraved with a series of very lively amorous scenes. With each draught that the young lady swallowed, these engravings became increasingly visible, and the court looked on with interest every time she put her nose in the cup, to see whether she blushed at what the ebbing wine revealed. If the debutante blushed, they laughed at her for her innocence. If she did not, she was laughed at for being too knowing. "Do you propose," asked Anne, "that the custom should be revived at Buckingham Palace?" "I do not," said Mr. Scogan. "I merely quoted the anecdote as an illustration of the custom, so genially frank, of the 16th century. I might have quoted other anecdotes to show that the customs of the 17th and 18th, of the 15th and 14th centuries, and indeed every other century from the time of Hammurabi onwards, were equally genial and equally frank. The only century in which customs were not characterised by the same cheerful openness was the 19th, of blessed memory. It was the astonishing exception, and yet, with what one must suppose was a deliberate disregard of history, it looked upon its horribly pregnant silences as normal and natural and right. The frankness of the previous 15 or 20,000 years was considered abnormal and perverse. It was a curious phenomenon. "I entirely agree," Mary panted with excitement in her effort to bring out what she had to say. "Havelock Ellis says..." Mr. Scogan, like a policeman arresting the flow of traffic, held up his hand. "He does, I know. And that brings me to my next point, the nature of the reaction. Havelock Ellis, the reaction, when it came, and we may say roughly that it set in a little before the beginning of this century, the reaction was to openness, but not to the same openness as had reigned in the earlier ages. It was to a scientific openness, not to the jovial frankness of the past, that we returned. The whole question of amour became a terribly serious one. Earnest young men wrote in the public prints that from this time forth it would be impossible ever again to make a joke of any sexual matter. Professors wrote thick books in which sex was sterilised and dissected. It has become customary for serious young women, like Mary, to discuss with philosophic calm matters of which the merest hint would have sufficed to throw the youth of the 60s into a delirium of amorous excitement. It is all very estimable, no doubt. But still, Mr. Scogan sighed, I, for one, should like to see, mingled with this scientific ardour, a little more of the jovial spirit of Rabelais and Chaucer. "I entirely disagree with you," said Mary. "Sex isn't a laughing matter, it's serious." "Perhaps," answered Mr. Scogan, "perhaps I'm an obscene old man, for I must confess that I cannot always regard it as wholly serious." "But I tell you," began Mary furiously. Her face had flushed with excitement. Her cheeks were the cheeks of a great ripe peach. "Indeed," Mr. Scogan continued, "it seems to me one of few permanently and everlastingly amusing subjects that exist. Amour is the one human activity of any importance in which laughter and pleasure preponderate, if ever so slightly, over misery and pain." "I entirely disagree," said Mary. There was a silence. Anne looked at her watch. "Nearly 7:45, she said. "I wonder when Ivor will turn up." She got up from her deck chair and, leaning her elbows on the balustrade of the terrace, looked out over the valley and towards the farther hills. Under the level evening sun the architecture of the land revealed itself. The deep shadows, the bright contrasting lights, gave the hills a new solidity. Irregularities of the surface, unsuspected before, were picked out with light and shade. The grass, the corn, the foliage of trees were stippled with intricate shadows. The surface of things had taken on a marvellous enrichment. "Look," said Anne suddenly, and pointed. On the opposite side of the valley, at the crest of the ridge, a cloud of dust flushed by the sunlight to rosy gold was moving rapidly along the skyline. "It's Ivor, one can tell by the speed." The dust cloud descended into the valley and was lost. A horn with the voice of a sea lion made itself heard, approaching. A minute later, Ivor came leaping round the corner of the house. His hair waved in the wind of his own speed. He laughed as he saw them. "Anne, darling," he cried, and embraced her, embraced Mary, very nearly embraced Mr. Scogan. "Well, here I am. I've come with incredulous speed." Ivor's vocabulary was rich, but a little erratic. "I'm not late for dinner, am I?" He hoisted himself up onto the balustrade and sat there, kicking his heels. With one arm he embraced a large stone flower-pot, leaning his head sideways against its hard and lichenous flanks in an attitude of trustful affection. He had brown, wavy hair, and his eyes were of a very brilliant, pale, improbable blue. His head was narrow, his face thin and rather long, his nose aquiline. In old age, though it was difficult to imagine Ivor old, he might grow to have an iron ducal grimness. But now, at 26, it was not the structure of his face that impressed one, it was its expression. That was charming and vivacious, and his smile was an irradiation. He was forever moving, restlessly and rapidly, but with an engaging gracefulness. His frail and slender body seemed to be fed by a spring of inexhaustible energy. "No, you're not late." "You're in time to answer a question," said Mr. Scogan. "We were arguing whether amour were a serious matter or no. What do you think? Is it serious?" "Serious?" echoed Ivor. "Most certainly." "I told you so," cried Mary triumphantly. "But in what sense serious?" Mr. Scogan asked. "I mean as an occupation. One can go on with it without ever getting bored." "I see," said Mr. Scogan. "Perfectly." "One can occupy oneself with it," Ivor continued, "always and everywhere. Women are always wonderfully the same. Shapes vary a little, that's all. In Spain, with his free hand, he described a series of ample curves. One can't pass them on the stairs. In England, he put the tip of his forefinger against the tip of his thumb and, lowering his hand, drew out this circle into an imaginary cylinder. In England, they're tubular, but their sentiments are always the same. At least, I've always found it so." "I'm delighted to hear it," said Mr. Scogan. End of chapter.